The summer sun hung low in a sky of pale, unbroken blue, painting the rolling fields in a soft, golden haze. It was a time of light, a season that felt less like the heavy march of history and more like a long, quiet walk through a beautiful, sleeping world. If you were to stand by the side of those dirt roads in the heart of that summer, you would not hear the roar of a coming storm. Instead, you would hear the steady, rhythmic crunch of thousands of boots against the dry earth, a soft, hypnotic sound that seemed to blend into the gentle hum of the cicadas hidden in the tall, sweet-smelling grass. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of wild chamomile and sun-baked earth. The dust rose up around the marching columns, catching the sunlight and turning it into a shimmering, golden mist. It settled gently on their shoulders, on the brims of their field caps, and on the quiet, plodding horses that pulled the wooden supply carts. For these young men, walking side by side under the vast, open canopy of the eastern sky, the world felt warm and full of simple, quiet promises. There were boys from quiet valleys and bustling towns with cobblestone streets, carrying with them the vivid, comforting memories of home. As they walked, the landscape unfolded before them like a magnificent, endless tapestry. Fields of bright yellow sunflowers turned their faces toward the light, nodding softly in the warm breeze. Sea after sea of ripening wheat rippled toward the horizon, an ocean of gold that seemed to welcome them deeper into its gentle embrace. It was a beautiful country, rich and green, and in those early days, the sheer vastness of it was not a source of dread, but of quiet wonder. They did not yet understand the true nature of distances here. To them, the map was just a piece of folded paper, a simple drawing of lines and names that could easily be conquered by putting one foot in front of the other. The horizon always looked so clear, so reachable. They believed, with the tender naivety of youth, that just beyond the next gentle hill, or just past the next quiet line of birch trees, the journey would come to its natural end. The days fell into a predictable, soothing rhythm. The mornings began with the soft pastel colors of dawn, the air cool and crisp for just a fleeting hour before the sun climbed high and warmed the dew away. They marched through the heat of the afternoon, sharing canteens of lukewarm water, passing a piece of hard bread down the line, communicating in the simple, unspoken language of shared exhaustion. A hand resting on a tired shoulder. A quiet joke murmured to break the monotony. A shared glance at a particularly beautiful cluster of clouds drifting slowly overhead. These were the small, profound moments of brotherhood that bound them together, woven into the fabric of the golden summer days. When the sun finally began its slow descent, painting the western sky in deep, bruised shades of violet and rose, the order to halt would ripple down the column. This was the most sacred time of the day. The heavy packs were slipped from aching shoulders, landing softly in the tall grass. Boots were unlaced with deep sighs of relief, and tired, swollen feet were allowed to breathe in the cooling evening air. Small campfires would blossom in the twilight, glowing like a scattering of orange stars across the darkening plains. Around these quiet fires, the true heart of the marching columns revealed itself. It was here, in the gentle, flickering light, that the men ceased to be soldiers and became simply sons, brothers, and sweethearts once again. The smell of wood smoke and roasted grain coffee mingled with the cool scent of the approaching night. They sat in small circles, leaning against the sturdy wooden wheels of the supply wagons or resting their backs against the smooth, white bark of the birch trees. Out came the small, battered leather wallets. Out came the carefully folded sheets of paper, the stubs of lead pencils, the treasured photographs with creased corners. It is a beautiful and heartbreaking thing to watch a young man write a letter home. The world around him fades away, and for a few quiet moments, he is transported back to a cozy kitchen, a familiar parlor, or a sunlit garden hundreds of miles away. They rested their paper on their knees, their faces softened by the firelight, and they wrote of the golden dust and the sunflowers. They wrote of the warm weather, assuring their mothers that they were eating well and keeping their socks dry. They wrote to their sweethearts, pressing small, dried wildflowers into the folds of the paper, promising that the march was going swiftly, that the end was in sight, and that they would be home to see the leaves turn color in the autumn. The words they chose were gentle, full of a quiet, unshakable optimism. There was no fear in their handwriting, no trembling in their lines. Why would there be? The sky above them was clear, their legs were strong, and the summer seemed infinite. They poured their love onto those small pages, folding them carefully, trusting that these fragile pieces of their hearts would somehow find their way back across the endless golden fields to the people who waited for them. In these quiet evening hours, acts of simple, everyday heroism unfolded without fanfare. A soldier who had saved a small lump of sugar all day would quietly press it into the hand of a younger companion who looked particularly weary. A medic would gently bandage a blistered heel, his touch light and practiced, murmuring words of quiet encouragement. Men would take turns mending each other's torn tunics, the flash of a needle catching the firelight, binding not just fabric, but the silent, enduring ties of friendship. As the fires burned down to soft, glowing embers, the sounds of the camp would slowly fade. The quiet hum of conversation would dissolve into a sleepy silence, broken only by the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof, the rustle of the wind through the tall grass, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of thousands of sleeping men. They lay beneath the open sky, wrapped in their blankets, staring up at a canopy of stars that looked exactly like the stars that shone over their own homes. Under that immense, sparkling sky, the world felt peaceful. The golden dust of the day had settled over the quiet earth, blanketing the fields and the forests in a soft, silvery stillness. They slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted, their minds drifting back to familiar streets and warm hearths. They did not know that the very earth they slept upon was so vast that it could swallow armies whole. They did not know that the beautiful, golden summer was a fleeting, fragile thing, a temporary guest in a land governed by deeper, colder forces. They lay there, cradled in the warmth of the season, blissfully unaware of the immense, silent distances that lay ahead, stretching out into the dark. For now, the night was gentle. The breeze was soft, carrying the faintest scent of pine from some distant, unseen forest. The letters they had written rested safely in their pockets, waiting for the morning mail cart, holding fast to the innocent promises of an early return. The gentle summer held them close, whispering softly through the leaves, allowing them to rest, to dream, and to believe that the golden days would simply go on, leading them safely to the end of the world. The horizon always promised an end, but in this immense and quiet land, it only ever gave way to another. At first, the marching had felt like a journey with a destination, a great adventure marked by milestones and cheering songs. But as the days stretched into weeks, the very nature of the world around them began to change. The soft, golden haze of the early summer slowly gave way to a brilliant, unyielding glare. The dirt roads, once a gentle path beneath their boots, dried into a fine, pale powder that rose in thick clouds with every step. It coated their uniforms, turning field gray to a ghostly white. It settled into the creases of their faces, painting them as tired, dusty statues moving endlessly through an ocean of grass. There is a profound and quiet exhaustion that comes not just from the muscles, but from the eyes. In the lands they had left behind, the world was comfortably small. A day of walking in their homeland would bring them past bustling towns, over ancient stone bridges, and through forests that had names and borders. A map was a faithful friend, a piece of paper that told the truth. A thumb's width meant a new village, a fresh well, a place to rest. But here, beneath the vast, towering dome of the eastern sky, the map began to feel like a quiet deception. They would wake in the cool blue light of dawn, shoulder their heavy packs, and walk until the sun sank low and red behind them. They would walk until their legs were numb and their shoulders ached with a dull, rhythmic pain. And yet, when the officers unrolled their maps by the evening fires, the distance they had covered looked like nothing more than a shallow scratch against an endless expanse. They had marched for a lifetime, but on the paper, they had barely moved. It was a dawning, creeping realization that did not arrive with a sudden shock, but settled over the columns like a heavy, invisible blanket. The scale of this country was not something a human mind was built to easily hold. The fields of wheat and wild steppe grass did not roll for miles, they rolled for a terrifying, beautiful eternity. As they marched, a deep, trance-like silence began to weave its way through the ranks. The cheerful banter of the early summer faded, replaced by the hypnotic, metronomic crunch of leather boots against the dry earth. Left, right, left, right. The sound became a lullaby of endurance, rocking them into a waking slumber. Men learned to sleep with their eyes open, their bodies moving purely out of habit, tethered to the man walking in front of them by an invisible thread of shared survival. The heavy iron helmets and leather harnesses, which had felt so light in the optimistic days of June, now felt as though they were dragging them down into the center of the earth. Yet, within this overwhelming immensity, the human heart sought out small, quiet islands of comfort. It is in the deepest exhaustion that the most beautiful moments of quiet heroism are born. When the world is too large to comprehend, a man's universe shrinks down to the two men walking beside him. You could see it in the gentle, wordless gestures that rippled down the dusty line. A soldier, his own lips cracked and dry, unhooking his metal canteen to offer the last warm sip of water to a younger friend who was stumbling. A veteran, his face lined with the deep grooves of the sun, silently reaching out to take a heavy rifle from the shoulder of a boy who looked ready to collapse, carrying the double burden without a single word of complaint. They helped each other adjust the chafing straps of their packs, their hands moving with the tender, practiced care of brothers. In the face of a landscape that simply did not care about them, they cared fiercely for one another. When they passed through the scattered, isolated villages, the sense of timelessness only deepened. These small gatherings of wooden houses with their thatched roofs seemed to float like solitary ships adrift on a sea of earth. The villages looked exactly like the ones they had passed the day before, and the ones they would pass the day after. Time was no longer measured in hours or days, but in the steady, rhythmic ache of their feet, and the slow, crawling arc of the sun across a sky that felt far too big. When the evening finally came, bringing with it a soft, fading light and a gentle drop in the temperature, the relief was profound, but subdued. There was less singing now. The fires were built smaller, their flames flickering quietly in the gathering dusk. Men simply collapsed into the tall grass, letting the earth hold their weary bodies. They untied their boots with slow, agonizing care, massaging bruised heels and blistered toes, grateful for the simple, beautiful luxury of remaining still. It was in these quiet evening hours, beneath a sky thick with unfamiliar stars, that the letters home began to change their tone. The grand talk of swift victories and marching bands softened into something much more intimate, much more vulnerable. A soldier would rest his notepad against the knapsack, chewing on the end of a pencil, trying to find the words to explain the unexplainable. He would write to his mother, describing a sky so wide it made him feel like a single grain of sand. He would write to his wife, telling her about a road that stretched perfectly straight until it disappeared over the edge of the world, begging her to describe the small, enclosed garden behind their house just so he could remember what boundaries felt like. The land here is beautiful, one might write in a careful, elegant script, trying not to worry the eyes that would read it, but it is so very large. We walk, and the horizon simply steps backward to make room for us. I miss the winding streets of our town. I miss the walls of our room. They folded these letters delicately, tucking them away, sending their quiet fears back to a world that still made sense. They did not speak of the dread that was beginning to pool in their stomachs, the quiet, creeping thought that perhaps they could walk forever and never reach the end. Instead, they lay back in the dust, shoulder to shoulder, pooling their warmth as the night air settled over the plains. They looked to the east, where the sky was a deep, bruised purple, completely devoid of answers. The gentle breeze rustled the dry grass, whispering secrets of distances they had yet to cross. They closed their eyes, letting the steady breathing of their companions soothe them to sleep. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again. Tomorrow, they would stand up, dust off their tunics, and put one tired foot in front of the other, marching quietly and bravely into a horizon that simply had no end. It did not announce itself with a sudden roar, but rather slipped in softly beneath the fading warmth of the summer sun. There was a day, quiet and unassuming, when the endless dust of the marching columns seemed to settle just a little faster onto the dry earth. The relentless, glaring heat that had pressed down upon their shoulders for weeks finally broke, exhaling a long, cooling breath across the vast plains. At first, it was a welcome relief. The men wiped their brows, unbuttoned their collars, and turned their faces into the breeze, grateful for the gentle, refreshing current that rippled through the tall, fading grass. But as the afternoon shadows began to stretch long and thin across the steppe, that gentle breeze carried with it something new. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible crispness. It was the scent of damp soil, of drying leaves, of a world preparing to go to sleep. It was the very first whisper of autumn, drifting down from the unseen northern forests, brushing lightly against the skin. As the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in pale, watered-down shades of peach and fading lavender, a quiet stillness fell over the ranks. The light was changing. It was no longer the heavy, golden haze of August, but a sharper, clearer silver that made the distant tree lines look stark and lonely. In the great, quiet birch groves they passed, the leaves had begun to turn. Just yesterday, it seemed, they had been a vibrant, endless green. Now, a faint dusting of yellow clung to their edges, shimmering like fragile coins in the fading light before detaching and drifting silently to the ground. When the evening halt was finally called, the men did not simply collapse into the grass as they had done in the weeks before. For the first time, a collective, involuntary shiver rippled through the resting army. The sweat that had soaked their shirts during the day's long march now cooled rapidly against their skin, sending a sudden, startling chill deep into their bones. They looked down at their uniforms. They were clad in the thin, light cotton of summer, garments designed for the warm breezes of familiar, gentle fields far to the west. The fabric was worn, soft from weeks of washing in shallow streams, and entirely unsuited for the sudden drop in the evening temperature. The sleeves that had been rolled up to the elbows for months were now quietly, carefully rolled back down, the cuffs buttoned tight against the cooling air. It was the older men, the veterans who had seen the seasons turn in many different lands, who felt the shift most deeply. They stood silently by the edge of the encampment, their hands tucked deep into their shallow pockets, their eyes narrowed as they stared up at the vast, pale sky. They watched the way the high clouds were gathering, moving with a new, hurried purpose. They felt the invisible weight of the atmosphere pressing down. They did not speak of it right away, not wanting to trouble the younger boys who were still laughing softly by the wagons, but in their quiet, weathered faces, a new, unspoken worry had taken root. They knew that in this boundless, overwhelming landscape, the weather was not merely a backdrop, it was a quiet, sleeping giant that had just begun to open its eyes. The rhythm of the camp shifted that evening. The small, scattered fires that used to be built simply to heat a tin of coffee were now built with a sudden, urgent care. Men scoured the edges of the woods for thicker branches, for dense logs that would burn long and hot into the night. They drew their circles tighter around the flames, instinctively leaning in, letting the comforting heat wash over their shivering shoulders. In this quiet drawing together, the small, profound moments of everyday heroism blossomed in the dim light. A soldier, noticing the chattering teeth of a young friend beside him, silently untied his own thin wool blanket from his pack and draped it gently over the boy's trembling shoulders. There were no grand words exchanged, only a soft nod of gratitude in the firelight. Men took turns sitting on the side of the fire that blocked the wind, shielding their companions from the biting gusts with their own bodies. They shared whatever warmth they could find, their shared resilience becoming a quiet, stubborn light against the gathering dark. When the tin cups of tea were passed around, hands wrapped tightly around the warm metal, letting the heat seep into their numb fingers before taking a sip. The simple act of drinking something warm felt like a miraculous gift, a brief, beautiful tether to a world that was comfortable and safe. As the stars appeared, cold and piercingly bright in the darkening sky, the quiet ritual of writing home began. But the letters penned beneath that crisp autumn sky carried a different melody than the cheerful notes of summer. The grand tales of endless marches softened into tender, wistful reflections. A young man, his breath misting faintly in the cool air, rested his chin on his knees and wrote to his mother. He asked, gently, playfully, if she had begun to knit the thick woolen socks she always made when the leaves began to fall at home. He wrote about the smell of the wood smoke and how it reminded him of the hearth in their small living room. He asked about the autumn harvest in their village, picturing the apples and the warm cider, trying to bridge the immense, chilling distance with words of love. He did not write that he was shivering. He did not write that his tunic felt as thin as paper against the vast Russian wind. He carefully folded away his private fears, sealing the envelope with a wish for her health, protecting her from the unsettling chill that was slowly wrapping around his own heart. The night deepened, and the wind began to whisper through the bare branches of the distant trees. It was a lonely, sweeping sound that seemed to carry the sheer, overwhelming scale of the continent within it. The men huddled close together beneath the wagons and in the shallow hollows of the earth, pooling their fragile body heat. They pulled their field caps down low over their ears and tucked their hands into their armpits, closing their eyes against the sharp, clean bite of the air. Tomorrow, they would walk again. Tomorrow, the sun would rise and offer a brief, deceptive warmth. But as they drifted into an uneasy sleep, listening to the crackle of the dying fires and the soft, steady breathing of the brothers beside them, they knew the world had irrevocably changed. The golden dust had blown away. The endless summer was gone. And in the quiet, trembling dark, the vast and silent winter had taken its very first breath. The sky wept for days, and the dry earth quietly opened to swallow the road. It began as a soft, whispering rain, falling gently through the golden leaves of the birch trees and pattering lightly against the canvas covers of the supply wagons. In the beginning, the men had welcomed it. The cool water washed the pale, lingering dust from their faces and offered a brief, refreshing drink to the parched fields. But the rain did not stop. It fell with a quiet, endless persistence, drumming a slow, hypnotic rhythm that blurred the edges of the world into a canvas of watery gray. Beneath this steady downpour, the landscape underwent a profound and silent transformation. The fine, powdery soil of the endless steppe, the very earth they had marched upon for thousands of miles, drank the water until it could hold no more. And then, it simply dissolved. The solid ground beneath their boots turned into a thick, dark paste, and then into a vast, unyielding ocean of mud. The local people had a word for this time of year, a word that the marching columns soon learned to whisper with heavy sighs, Rasputitsa. The season of no roads. It was a time when the world lost its shape, when the boundaries between land and water melted away, leaving only a boundless sea of thick, grasping brown clay. To walk through this mud was like walking through a heavy, waking dream. Every single step required a conscious, monumental effort. The earth seemed to reach up and grab hold of their leather boots, creating a deep, sucking sound that became the only music of the march. A boot that had weighed only a few pounds in the morning felt like a block of solid iron by midday. Men would lift a foot, straining against the heavy suction, only to sink halfway up to their knees the moment they set it back down. The quiet rhythm of the march, the steady left, right that had carried them across the continent, was broken. It was replaced by a slow, agonizing slog. Lines of men stretched out for miles, moving at a fragile crawl, their heads bowed against the relentless, misty rain. Their field-gray uniforms were entirely coated in wet, heavy earth, turning them into a procession of weary clay statues moving slowly across a drowning world. In this liquid landscape, the great machines of the modern army fell silent, rendered entirely helpless by the soft, indifferent earth. Tires spun uselessly, burying themselves to the axles in deep, watery ruts. And so, the burden fell back onto the oldest, quietest companions of man, the horses. There is a deep, heartbreaking tragedy in the eyes of a weary horse, and in those endless fields of mud, a silent, tender bond was forged between the struggling animals and the exhausted men. The draft horses, their beautiful coats slick with rain and matted with clay, leaned into their heavy leather collars, their breath pluming in the damp, cooling air. They pulled with all their mighty hearts, their hooves slipping and sliding in the treacherous muck. When a wagon sank too deep, the men did not yell or crack whips. They were too tired for anger, and they felt too much pity for the gentle beasts. Instead, they waded into the freezing mud alongside them. They pressed their own shoulders against the heavy, wooden spokes of the wheels, sinking to their waists in the brown slurry. Together, now, a quiet voice would urge through the rain. And together, man and beast would strain against the earth, sharing the impossible burden, bound by a quiet, desperate reliance on one another. When the wagon finally lurched free, a soldier might gently stroke the muddy neck of the trembling horse, whispering soft words of comfort into its twitching ear, a small, private moment of love in a world of gray. The silent frustration of the Rasputitsa seeped into everything. It was a creeping exhaustion that settled deep into the bones. There was nowhere to sit, nowhere to lay a heavy pack, nowhere to simply rest. To stop moving meant to slowly sink. Yet, even here, in this bleak and formless ocean, the human spirit found ways to kindle small, warm lights of kindness. Because everyone was covered in the same miserable earth, a profound sense of equality settled over the ranks. The divisions of rank and background washed away in the rain. When a young soldier, his legs trembling from the sheer effort of pulling his boots from the mire, finally stumbled and fell to his knees in the cold mud, he was not left alone. Strong hands, equally caked in clay, would reach down beneath his arms to gently pull him back to his feet. Someone would use a piece of damp cloth to carefully wipe the mud from his eyes and mouth. Just a little further, an older companion would murmur, patting his shoulder. "Just keep your eyes on my back." When the evening finally cast its dark, shadowy veil over the weeping landscape, finding a place to sleep felt like a cruel puzzle. The ground offered no comfort. Men sought out the smallest patches of elevated earth, the roots of ancient, lonely trees, or the wooden beds of the supply carts. They gathered branches that were soaked through, spending hours coaxing tiny, sputtering flames to life just to have a focal point of light in the overwhelming dark. They sat close to these fragile fires, steam rising slowly from their sodden wool coats. The evening ritual was no longer a time of relaxed conversation, but a silent, methodical chore of survival. They used small sticks to scrape the thick, heavy crust of mud from each other's boots and trousers. It was an act of intimate, brotherly service. They worked quietly, the scraping of wood against leather blending with the endless patter of the rain, cleaning away the day's burden so that their friends might walk just a little lighter tomorrow. Underneath the shelter of a canvas tarp, huddled against the damp cold, the letters home were written with numbed fingers. The paper was soft from the humidity, the pencil marks faint and blurry. How could they possibly describe this world to someone sitting in a dry, warm parlor? A father would lean over his small notepad, shielding it from a stray drop of water, and write to his daughters. He did not tell them about the horses, or the wagons buried in the clay, or the way his legs ached so deeply he could not sleep. Instead, he wrote about the memory of cobblestone streets. He asked them to describe the feeling of a dry wooden floor beneath their bare feet. "The rain here is very stubborn," he would write, keeping his words light, "and the roads are a bit untidy. But we are moving forward, step by slow step. When I return, I think I shall never complain about sweeping the front steps again." He tucked the letter into his tunic, right over his heart, a small, dry piece of home pressed against the damp, shivering reality of the front. As the night deepened, the rain finally slowed to a soft, misty drizzle. The camp grew quiet, the exhausted men falling into a heavy, dreamless slumber wherever they could find a square foot of stable ground. They leaned against each other, sharing their meager body heat, their breathing falling into a slow, synchronized rhythm. All around them, the vast, mud-covered earth stretched out in the darkness, glistening faintly beneath the pale, hidden moon. It was a landscape of stillness now, a heavy, silent ocean that held the army tight in its grip. But beneath the frustration, beneath the exhaustion, there was a quiet, stubborn resilience beating in thousands of resting hearts. They had walked through the dust, and they would wade through the mud. They closed their eyes against the damp night, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the rain to cease, and praying quietly for the ground to freeze. A single word can become a glowing ember in the dark, a tiny spark of warmth for those who have forgotten the feeling of a hearth. As the endless, liquid earth of the autumn rain slowly began to harden into deep, frozen ruts, a new presence settled over the marching columns. It was not a physical thing. It was not a change in the wind, or a shift in the pale, overcast sky. It was a name, whispered from man to man, passing down the weary lines like a gentle, unseen current. Moscow. To these tired men, walking in boots that were heavy with drying clay, the name no longer represented a point on a map. It had shed all of its earthly reality and transformed into something entirely different. It had become a myth, a beautiful, floating dream that hovered just beyond the gray horizon. They began to call it the White City. In their minds, built from the deep, aching exhaustion of months on the road, this city was not a place of conflict or struggle. It was a sanctuary. They pictured great, sweeping avenues lined with solid stone buildings that could block out the biting wind. They imagined towering domes of gold catching the soft winter sunlight, shining like beacons of rest across the desolate plains. But most of all, they pictured roofs. Real, solid roofs that did not leak. They imagined heavy wooden doors that could be pulled shut against the vastness of the Russian night, locking the endless fields and the cruel weather outside. When the light failed each evening, painting the sky in lonely shades of charcoal and bruised purple, the rituals of the camp took on a new, quiet kind of reverence. Finding what had become a difficult chore, as the damp forests offered only stubborn, smoking branches. But they gathered what they could, carefully nursing tiny, sputtering flames to life. These fires were small and fragile, hissing as the moisture boiled out of the green wood, but to the men huddled around them, they were the center of the universe. They drew in close, shoulder to shoulder, wrapping their thin summer blankets tightly around themselves. Their faces were hollowed by fatigue, illuminated by the soft, flickering orange light. And it was here, in the intimate, quiet circle of the firelight, that the whispers of the White City truly came alive. The rumors blossomed in the dark like delicate winter flowers. A young man, his hands wrapped tightly around a tin cup of warm water, would lean forward and murmur that he had spoken to a driver from the vanguard. "They say you can almost see the glow of the street lamps," he would whisper, his eyes wide and bright with a fragile hope. "They say it is only a few days more. Just a few more days of walking, and we will be sleeping in real beds." Another soldier, an older man with gray dusting his temples, would nod slowly, feeding a small twig into the struggling fire. "I heard there are grand apartments," he would add, his voice low and soothing, "with heavy curtains, and carpets thick enough to sink your boots into. I heard there are great stores of coal, and running water that doesn't taste of the earth." It did not matter if the stories were true. In the grand, silent emptiness of the landscape, these quiet rumors were a vital form of sustenance. They were a shared blanket of hope that they pulled over themselves to ward off the creeping chill. The mere act of speaking about warm beds, about dry clothes, and about the end of the marching, possessed a profound, healing magic. It softened the harsh lines on their faces and brought a faint, gentle smile to lips that were cracked by the wind. This sharing of hope became an act of everyday heroism. When a soldier sat staring blankly into the dark, his spirit finally buckling under the weight of the endless horizon, a companion would slowly shuffle closer. He wouldn't offer grand speeches or empty promises. He would simply share a piece of bread, bump his shoulder gently against his friend's, and offer a quiet rumor. "My lieutenant said the bakers are already preparing the ovens in the city," he might whisper. "Imagine the smell of fresh bread, warm from the fire. We just have to make it over the next ridge." That soft, imaginative tether was often all it took to pull a man back from the edge of despair. They carried each other not just with their arms, but with their shared dreams. As the evening deepened and the wind began its mournful song across the frozen grass, the men reached into their tunics for their battered notebooks and stubs of pencil. Writing letters by the sputtering light of damp wood was a difficult task, but it was a necessary one. They had to send the dream of the White City back home, to the wives and mothers who waited anxiously by their own warm hearths. They did not write about the numb fingers holding the pencil, or the way the cold was beginning to seep through the soles of their boots. They shielded their loved ones from the vast and different reality of the steppe. Instead, they wrote about the beautiful, mythical city that awaited them. "Do not worry for me," a young boy would write to his mother, his handwriting slightly unsteady from the cold, but his words full of a tender, protective reassurance. "We are so very close now. Soon, we will be in the great city. I will find a beautiful room with a large window, and I will finally rest. I will be warm, and the marching will be over. We will celebrate there, and then, before you know it, I will be walking up our front path." He folded the paper with reverent care, sealing the promise inside. To write it down made it feel real. It made the White City a destination that could be touched, a place that existed not just in the exhausted whispers of the camp, but in the hopeful hearts of the people they loved hundreds of miles away. The fires eventually burned down to soft, red embers, glowing faintly in the deep velvet dark of the night. The stories and the rumors faded into a gentle silence, replaced by the slow, rhythmic breathing of men finding their rest. They lay together on the hardening earth, their bodies pressed close, seeking whatever warmth they could share. But even as they slept, the dream of the White City kept watch over them. It drifted through their slumbers, painting pictures of golden domes and warm, glowing windows. It was a beautiful, necessary illusion, a beacon of light in a world that was slowly turning white and cold. It gave them the strength to close their eyes, and the courage to know that when the gray dawn broke, they would stand up, shoulder their heavy packs, and walk just a little further toward the warmth. To step beneath the canopy of the great eastern forests was to leave the known world behind, and enter a realm where the trees themselves seemed to hold their breath. For weeks, the men had wandered beneath an open, endless sky, feeling the weight of the vast plains pressing down upon them. But as the marching columns slowly left the open steppe and approached the deep, ancient timberlands, the nature of their journey profoundly changed. The transition was not sudden, but rather a slow, quiet swallowing of the light. First came the scattered, pale trunks of the birch trees, standing like solitary sentinels in the fading autumn grass. Then came the great, towering pines, their dark, heavy boughs interlocking high above, weaving a thick, wooden ceiling that completely shut out the sky. When they finally stepped fully into the embrace of the deep woods, it felt as though they had walked into the nave of a colossal, forgotten cathedral. The relentless, whipping wind of the plains was abruptly silenced, caught and tangled in the millions of branches overhead. In its place, a heavy, muffled stillness settled over the ranks. The air here was entirely different. It was cool and damp, carrying the deep, rich scent of decaying leaves, ancient moss, and the sharp, clean fragrance of pine resin. At first, the shelter of the trees was a gentle comfort. It was a reprieve from the biting gusts that had chilled them to the bone, and the ground, carpeted with decades of fallen pine needles, was mercifully soft beneath their aching feet. But as they marched deeper into the heart of the wilderness, that quiet comfort began to shift into something else entirely. The forest was a place of deep, beautiful, and haunting isolation. The marching columns, which had spread out like a great, gray river across the open fields, were now forced into narrow, winding paths that threaded through the massive trunks. The line stretched out, winding and bending, until a soldier could no longer see the front or the back of the procession. He could only see the man directly in front of him, and the man directly behind. Beyond that small, fragile chain of humanity, there was only the endless, towering labyrinth of wood and shadow. The light that managed to filter down through the canopy was pale and silvery, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every step. In this dim, underwater twilight, the eyes of tired men began to play gentle tricks. A twisted root looked like a sleeping figure. A thick, low-hanging branch appeared as an arm reaching out from the dark. It was a profound psychological weight, a creeping, quiet paranoia that settled softly over the men. In the open plains, the danger was visible. You could see the empty horizon for miles. But in the forest, the horizon was never more than a few dozen feet away, blocked by a wall of rough, dark bark. There was a constant, unsettling sensation of unseen eyes watching from the deep underbrush. It was not a sudden, sharp panic, but a slow, lingering feeling that they were unwelcome guests in a primordial world that had stood undisturbed since the dawn of time. The silence of the woods was so immense that it seemed to swallow sound entirely. The men found themselves instinctively lowering their voices, speaking only in hushed, reverent whispers, as if terrified of waking whatever ancient spirits slumbered in the deep thickets. The clinking of their metal canteens, the creak of the leather harnesses, the soft crunch of their boots on the pine needles, every small noise felt like a trespass against the profound quiet of the forest. Yet, within this heavy, isolating atmosphere, the deepest human bonds were quietly reinforced. When the wilderness feels too large and too mysterious to bear, the simple presence of another human being becomes a lifeline. You could see it in the way the men moved together through the shadows. If a young soldier stopped for a moment, his eyes wide and fixed on a dark, impenetrable patch of the tree line, gripped by the sudden, overwhelming sensation of being watched, he was never left to face it alone. An older companion, a man who had learned to read the quiet tremors of fear in the shoulders of the boys he marched with, would step up closely behind him. There would be no loud words, no reprimands to keep moving. Just the firm, warm weight of a hand resting gently on the young man's shoulder. A soft, grounding squeeze. A whispered, "I know. I feel it too. Just keep looking at my boots." These small, silent acts of everyday heroism were the only things that kept the crushing isolation at bay. They tethered the men to one another, building a fragile, invisible bridge of comfort through the terrifying beauty of the trees. When the evening approached, the forest did not experience a sunset. Instead, the pale light simply drained away, and the shadows that had been hiding beneath the branches slowly stretched out to reclaim the entire world. The dark of the deep woods was absolute. It was a thick, heavy blackness that felt as though it had a physical weight. Setting up camp in this environment was a quiet, intimate affair. They nestled themselves between the massive, twisting roots of the ancient pines, finding small hollows lined with dry needles that offered a natural bed. Fires were built with extraordinary care. They could not build the large, roaring bonfires of the open steppe. The canopy was too dense, and the fear of the unseen woods pressing in around them made them want to remain hidden. Instead, they built tiny, sheltered flames deep within small pits dug into the earth. These little fires glowed like captive fireflies in the immense dark. The men huddled tightly around them, their faces completely illuminated by the soft, warm light, while the rest of the world vanished entirely into the black. In these tight, glowing circles, the men found their sanctuary. They shared pieces of hard bread, passing a single tin cup of warm water from hand to weary hand. They sat so close that their shoulders overlapped, pooling their body heat, drawing comfort from the steady, rhythmic breathing of their brothers. It was in these tiny spheres of light, surrounded by an ocean of dark timber, that the letters home were written. The scratching of pencil on paper sounded impossibly loud in the quiet night. The words they chose were profoundly tender, heavily shaped by the deep isolation of their surroundings. A soldier, resting his notebook on his knee, would stare into the tiny flame and try to bridge the unimaginable gap between the deep Russian wilderness and the cozy, familiar rooms he remembered. He did not write about the feeling of the unseen eyes, or the way the dark seemed to press against his chest. He protected his family from the haunting weight of the forest. Instead, he wrote of the beauty of the trees. He compared the towering pines to the friendly, familiar woods on the edge of their hometown, where they used to walk on Sunday afternoons. "The trees here are very tall, and they keep the wind away," he would write gently, his handwriting neat and careful. "It is very quiet tonight. I am sitting with the others by a small fire, and the smell of the pine reminds me of the holidays at home. We are safe together, and the canopy feels like a great, protective roof over our heads. He would fold the paper, knowing that his words were only half true. The canopy was a roof, yes, but it was one that locked him into a vast, unknowable maze. Yet, by writing those words, by conjuring the image of a peaceful Sunday stroll, he brought a tiny fragment of his home into the alien dark. He held the letter to his chest for a moment before tucking it into his tunic, feeling a brief, beautiful spark of warmth against the chill. As the night deepened, the men took turns standing watch, though there was little to see beyond the first row of illuminated tree trunks. The guards stood perfectly still, their breath pluming softly in the cold, damp air, listening to the mysterious symphony of the nocturnal forest. The sudden snap of a dry twig somewhere out in the void. The mournful hoot of an unseen owl. The gentle, rhythmic sighing of the wind moving through the very tops of the trees, hundreds of feet above, sounding like the distant rush of the ocean. For the men trying to sleep, these sounds wove themselves into their exhaustion. They pulled their thin wool blankets up over their ears, burying their faces in the crook of their arms. They learned to surrender to the vastness of the woods, realizing that the ancient forest did not care about their long march, their quiet fears, or the mythical white city they were trying to reach. The forest was entirely indifferent, wrapped in its own deep, eternal slumber. And so, surrounded by the shadows and the towering, silent sentinels of wood, the men finally allowed themselves to rest. They drifted off to sleep, tethered to the earth by the scent of the pine, tethered to each other by the shared warmth of their huddled bodies. They slept in the heart of the deep wilderness, trusting that the small, fragile bonds of their brotherhood would be enough to guide them out of the shadows when the pale, silver dawn finally arrived. It fell from the sky not as a warning, but as a silent, delicate promise of peace. For weeks, the sky had been a heavy, weeping thing, pouring cold rain onto an earth that had long since surrendered to the mud. The world had been painted in shades of exhausting brown and desolate gray. But on this particular morning, the unending drizzle finally ceased. The wind, which had howled across the open plains and moaned through the dark pines, suddenly dropped away, leaving behind a stillness so profound it felt as though the entire continent was holding its breath. The air changed. It was no longer simply damp, it grew crisp, sharp, and incredibly clean. The men, marching in their weary columns, could feel a new, stinging purity in the breath they drew into their lungs. And then, tumbling gently from the pale, pearlescent clouds, came the very first flake of snow. It was a solitary, wandering thing, drifting down on an unseen current of air. It danced lightly above the marching lines, catching the faint, silvery light, before coming to rest softly on the dark wool of a soldier's sleeve. He stopped, just for a moment, and stared at it. A perfect, crystalline star, entirely fragile, existing for only a heartbeat before melting away into a tiny drop of dark water. Then came another. And another. Within moments, the air was filled with a soft, swirling multitude of white. It did not fall with the violent urgency of a storm, but with a slow, hypnotic grace, like millions of tiny feathers drifting down to blanket the tired earth. After the relentless grind of the dust, after the agonizing, suctioning despair of the mud ocean, this sudden change felt like a quiet miracle. It was a brief, deceptive moment of sheer, fragile beauty that gently arrested the hearts of thousands of exhausted men. All along the miles of winding roads, the rhythm of the march broke. Men lifted their faces to the sky, letting the cool, soft flakes settle on their cheeks and their eyelashes. The thick layer of dirt and exhaustion that had masked their youth seemed to wash away in the pure, white light. For a few precious minutes, they were not soldiers trudging toward a distant, uncertain battle. They were boys again, standing in the first snow of the year, their eyes wide with the simple, innocent wonder of the changing season. A young man near the front of a supply wagon stepped out of the heavy ruts, tilted his head back, and stuck out his tongue, trying to catch a falling flake. The man beside him, a weary veteran whose face was lined with the deep geography of a long war, let out a soft, genuine laugh, a sound that had not been heard in the ranks for many, many days. It was a quiet, bubbling sound of pure relief. He reached out and playfully nudged the younger boy's shoulder, a small, tender moment of shared joy in the middle of nowhere. There was a practical relief, as well. As the temperature continued its slow, steady descent, the vast ocean of mud that had trapped their boots and swallowed their wagons finally began to surrender. The soft, grasping clay hardened into solid, frozen ridges. The great draft horses, which had strained so pitifully against the mire, suddenly found firm footing. The heavy wooden wheels rolled over the earth instead of sinking into it. The sudden ease of movement felt like a heavy chain being lifted from their shoulders. The march became lighter, swifter. The men walked with their heads held a little higher, energized by the crisp air and the beautiful, falling snow that was quietly repainting the ugly, scarred landscape into a pristine wonderland of white. The fields of ruined, trampled grass were covered over, smoothed out into soft, rolling dunes of pearl. The dark, imposing pines of the forest donned heavy mantles of white, their branches drooping gracefully under the gentle weight, looking exactly like the postcards of winter forests sold in the little shops back home. The ugliness of the long march was hidden away, buried beneath a clean, silent sheet. But beauty, in this vast and indifferent land, was a fleeting guest. As the afternoon wore on, the gentle flurry did not stop. The snowflakes grew thicker, heavier, falling with a quiet, determined persistence. The sun, which had been only a pale suggestion behind the clouds, slipped below the horizon, taking with it the last, fragile illusion of warmth. And as the twilight shadows stretched across the newly whitened earth, the true nature of the snowfall began to reveal itself. The crispness in the air sharpened into a biting, physical ache. The men, still dressed in their thin, summer cottons and light canvas tunics, felt the temperature plummet with a terrifying speed. The very fabric that was supposed to protect them became cold to the touch. The sweat that had lightly gathered on their backs during the day's march now turned to a layer of frost against their skin. The boots, which had been soaked through with the autumn mud, froze entirely solid, turning into heavy, unyielding blocks of ice around their numb feet. The joy of the morning slowly, quietly evaporated, replaced by a dawning, heavy realization. The snow was not a passing shower. It was not a beautiful, momentary distraction. It was the closing of a door. The season had turned, definitively and unforgivingly, and they were caught out in the open, hundreds of miles from a warm hearth. When the order to halt was given, the camp did not settle with the usual relieved sighs. Instead, there was a frantic, hushed urgency. The ground, which had been their bed for months, was now a frozen slab of iron, covered in a thickening layer of snow. Men scrambled to find branches that were not entirely encased in ice, their bare hands trembling uncontrollably as they tried to strike matches that kept slipping from their numb fingers. When the small, sputtering fires were finally coaxed into life, they offered a light that was beautiful but weak. The men huddled around them, pressing themselves so closely together that they became a single, shivering entity. They wrapped their thin blankets around their shoulders, pulling their soft field caps down over their ears, but the cold seemed to seep up from the very earth itself, bypassing the fabric and settling deep into their bones. The quiet banter that usually accompanied the evening meal was gone, replaced by the soft, rhythmic chattering of teeth and the harsh, hollow sound of men trying to cough life back into their lungs. They held their hands perilously close to the tiny flames, watching the snow melt from their knuckles, only to feel the chill rush back the moment they pulled away. In this new, freezing world, the everyday heroism of the march transformed into acts of desperate, quiet preservation. An older soldier, seeing a young boy sobbing softly from the sheer agony of his thawing fingers, did not speak a word. He simply unbuttoned his own thin tunic, took the boy's freezing hands, and placed them against the bare skin of his own chest, sharing the very core of his body heat. He held the boy close, rocking him gently, a silent father in a landscape of ice. Men gave up their own meager portions of warm water, pressing the tin cups to the lips of those who were shaking too violently to hold them. They became each other's blankets, each other's shelter, bound by a love that was forged in the absolute extreme of human endurance. Later, as the wind began to pick up, lifting the fallen snow and swirling it into dancing, ghostly shapes across the dark fields, the letters home were drawn out. The paper was stiff from the cold. The lead pencils, held in rigid, clumsy fingers, tore lightly at the pages. The words they wrote that night were deeply poignant, a heartbreaking blend of the morning's fleeting beauty and the evening's creeping dread. A soldier, his back pressed against the frozen wheel of a supply cart, sheltered his notebook with his body and wrote to his wife. He pictured her in their small kitchen, perhaps stoking the fire in the iron stove, the room smelling of warm bread and dried herbs. He wanted so desperately to be in that room. The first snow fell today, he wrote, his handwriting jagged and uneven. At first, it was so beautiful. It reminded me of the day we walked through the park, the year we were married, when the flakes caught in your hair. The earth here is finally white and clean. But my darling, it is so very cold. The wind moves right through us. We are hoping to reach the city soon, where there are roofs and fires. Keep the stove burning bright for me. Think of me in the warmth, so that I might feel it too. He did not write that he could no longer feel his toes. He did not write that he was terrified to close his eyes, fearing that if he slept, the creeping numbness would simply carry him away. He folded his fear away, sealing the letter with a breath that plumed white in the freezing air, sending only his love across the vast, icy distance. As the deep night settled over the encampment, the silence returned. It was no longer the peaceful stillness of the morning, but a heavy, oppressive quiet. The snow continued to fall, burying the tracks they had made, burying the ashes of their small fires, burying the very memory of the golden summer. The men lay huddled together beneath the wagons and in the shallow, frozen depressions of the earth, a patchwork of gray and white. They closed their eyes, listening to the soft, rhythmic hiss of the snow brushing against the canvas tarps. The white city they had dreamed of felt incredibly far away now, hidden behind a veil of endless, falling ice. They drifted into an uneasy, trembling sleep, cradled in the indifferent arms of the deep Russian winter, knowing now, with absolute and quiet certainty, that the cold was here to stay. There is a kind of cold that does not merely bite the skin, but reaches deep into the very bones of the earth and stops the heart of the world. In the days that followed the first beautiful, deceptive snowfall, the landscape underwent a profound and terrifying transformation. The gentle, swirling flakes that had blanketed the muddy plains gave way to a sky of absolute, brilliant clarity. It was a pale, icy blue that stretched from horizon to horizon, entirely devoid of clouds, offering a sun that shone with a harsh, blinding light but provided no warmth at all. Beneath this vast, crystalline dome, the temperature began to plummet with a sudden, brutal ferocity that defied human comprehension. This was not the crisp, invigorating chill of an autumn morning back home. This was a deep, primordial freeze, a heavy, invisible weight that pressed down upon the marching columns. The air itself seemed to change its nature. It grew incredibly thin and brittle, stinging the nostrils and freezing the moisture on the men's eyelashes into tiny, heavy pearls of ice. When they exhaled, their breath did not just mist, it materialized into thick, white plumes that hung in the still air before settling as frost upon their woolen collars. The soft, powdery snow beneath their boots hardened into a crust of solid ice, and every footstep rang out with a sharp, squeaking crunch that echoed loudly in the vast, empty stillness of the steppe. But the most profound tragedy of this sudden, unimaginable cold was not felt first by the men, but by the great, roaring beasts of iron that accompanied them. For months, the mechanized heart of the army had been its greatest pride and its most comforting companion. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the heavy transport trucks, the deep, vibrating growl of the tracked vehicles, these were the sounds of progress, the sounds of an unstoppable journey toward the White City. The men had learned to sleep to the lullaby of idling engines. They had leaned against the warm metal hoods during the cool autumn evenings, drawing comfort from the steady, mechanical heat. The machines were their tireless beasts of burden, carrying their food, their heavy coats, and their hopes across the endless miles. But as the mercury dropped deeper into the abyss, a quiet, creeping paralysis began to take hold of the iron. It started subtly, in the darkest, coldest hours before dawn. A driver, bundled in every thin layer of clothing he possessed, would climb into the freezing cabin of his truck and press the ignition. Instead of the familiar, confident roar, the engine would offer only a slow, agonizing groan. The thick, dark oil that flowed through the veins of the machines had begun to change. It lost its liquid grace, thickening into a heavy, unyielding tar. The grease that lubricated the gears and wheels solidified into a substance as hard as stone. All along the miles of snow-covered roads, the great machines began to cough, sputter, and die. It was a heartbreaking sound, the slow, mechanical strangulation of engines fighting for life against an invisible, overwhelming enemy. They gasped for air through frozen filters, their iron hearts beating slower and slower until, with a final, shuddering sigh, they simply surrendered to the cold. The silence that followed was absolute, and it was terrifying. The men who cared for these machines, the drivers and the mechanics, felt a profound, private despair. They loved their engines with the tender, quiet devotion of men who entrust their lives to steel and wire. To see them failing, to see them transformed into dead, hollow monuments of ice, brought a new kind of panic to the ranks. It was a quiet, suffocating realization that the modern world they had brought with them was entirely incompatible with the ancient, sleeping fury of the Russian winter. In their desperate attempts to coax life back into the iron, these men performed acts of incredible, quiet heroism. They worked with bare hands, because their thick wool mittens were too clumsy to grip the delicate wrenches and tiny bolts. But touching the freezing metal was a perilous act. The steel had become so unnaturally cold that it behaved like a cruel magnet, instantly freezing the moisture on their skin. A mechanic, rushing to adjust a frozen valve, would cry out softly in the dim light as he pulled his hand away, leaving torn patches of his own skin frosted against the engine block. They did not abandon their mechanical companions easily. Along the winding, icy paths, strange and desperate rituals unfolded. Men scavenged for whatever dry wood they could find beneath the snow, not to warm themselves, but to warm their engines. They built small, sputtering fires directly beneath the heavy steel oil pans, watching with anxious, hopeful eyes as the flames licked the frozen underbellies of the trucks. They huddled close, shielding the fragile fires from the biting wind with their own freezing bodies, murmuring soft words of encouragement to the unhearing metal as if they were nursing a sick child back from the brink. But the cold was too immense. It swallowed the heat of the tiny fires as quickly as it swallowed the hope in their hearts. The machines remained silent, frozen solid to the earth, their heavy tires locked in tombs of ice. As the great engines died, a profound shift occurred in the soul of the army. The illusion of speed and invincibility shattered, leaving behind a fragile, terrifying vulnerability. The men were no longer riding a wave of modern momentum, they were simply lonely figures standing in a vast, white desert, entirely reliant on their own 2 frozen feet. Yet, as the iron failed them, the human heart found ways to compensate. The sudden uselessness of the vehicles turned them into something else entirely. They became small, frozen sanctuaries. The canvas-covered beds of the dead transport trucks, though offering no heat of their own, provided a precious barrier against the relentless, cutting wind. When the long, agonizing days of marching came to an end, the men would crowd into the backs of these silent trucks. They packed themselves in so tightly that they could not move, a tangled mass of shivering arms and legs. In the pitch-black darkness of the canvas tents, they pooled their meager body heat. They shared everything. If one man found a small, frozen heel of bread in his pack, he did not eat it alone. He broke it into tiny pieces with his numb fingers and passed it gently through the dark, making sure the men at the very edges of the group received their share. If a young soldier's teeth were chattering so violently that he could not catch his breath, the older men would pull him into the center of the huddle. They would wrap their arms around him, pressing their own freezing chests against his, offering the quiet, enduring warmth of brotherhood. "Breathe with me," a gentle voice would whisper in the dark, barely audible over the howling wind outside. Just breathe slowly. The iron is cold, but we are not. We are still here. It was in these desperately cold, crowded spaces, by the light of a single, carefully shielded match or a tiny stub of a candle, that the letters home were written. They were written with hands that ached so deeply it brought tears to the eyes, the pencil lead barely making a mark on the stiff, frozen paper. A young driver, a boy who had proudly spent his entire youth covered in engine grease in his father's garage, sat huddled in the corner of his lifeless truck. He blew softly onto his fingers, trying to coax enough feeling into them to hold his pencil. He wrote to his father, the words forming a tender, heartbreaking confession. "The cold here is something I cannot explain," he wrote, his handwriting small and cramped. "It has stopped the engines, Papa. I tried everything you taught me. I tried to warm the oil, I cleaned the lines, but the iron has simply gone to sleep. I feel as though I have failed my beautiful machine. It sits outside now, perfectly still, covered in white. But do not worry for me. The truck is dead, but the men inside are looking after one another. We share our blankets, and we share our breath. The machines have stopped, but we will keep walking. We will walk until we find the warmth again." He folded the letter carefully, treating it like a fragile glass ornament, and tucked it deep inside his tunic, right against his skin. He needed to keep it close to his heart, hoping that his own fading body heat would keep the words alive until they could find their way home. As the night deepened and the wind shrieked across the open steppe, beating uselessly against the frozen metal sides of the vehicles, the men inside closed their eyes. They listened to the terrifying, absolute silence of the engines. They realized, with a quiet and profound acceptance, that the era of writing was over. The journey ahead would not be measured in miles per hour, but in agonizing, individual steps. They were stripped of their armor, stripped of their momentum, left only with the clothes on their backs and the men by their sides. But as they drifted into a fragile, trembling slumber, surrounded by the dead iron that had frozen entirely solid, a small, stubborn spark remained. The machines had surrendered to the winter, but the men had not. They held onto each other in the dark, trusting in the quiet, enduring power of human warmth, waiting for the pale, icy dawn that would call them to stand up, step out into the freezing void, and walk once more. A fragile piece of folded paper can sometimes hold all the warmth of a forgotten sun. The world of the marching columns had shrunk. It was no longer the vast, rolling expanse of the summer steppe, nor the endless, shadowy labyrinth of the autumn forests. Their universe had contracted into the claustrophobic, icy confines of the winter dugouts. They carved these small, dark sanctuaries out of the frozen earth, hacking at the unyielding ground with spades that rang out like bells against the solid clay, until it yielded just enough space for men to huddle together, hidden from the biting, relentless wind. The walls of these shallow trenches sparkled with a cruel, indifferent beauty. They were coated in a thick, white frost that grew slowly from the moisture of the men's own breathing. The sky above was a narrow ribbon of heavy slate gray, always threatening more snow. In this monochrome world of stark white and deep shadow, color was a distant memory. The world was cold, still, and drained of all its vibrant life. And then, a whisper would pass down the icy line, softer than the rustle of the dry snow blowing across the roof of the trench. The mail has come. It was a quiet, staggering miracle. The mail cart, pulled by exhausted, steaming horses with frost clinging to their eyelashes, was a fragile, invisible tether connecting the very edge of the world back to the warm, beating center of their hearts. The canvas bags were heavy with paper, ink, and love. When the bundles were untied, the names called out in the dim, freezing light felt like a sacred roll call of souls. Men reached out with hands wrapped in torn, filthy rags, their fingers stiff, swollen, and clumsy, to accept the thin envelopes. Just holding the letter was a profound, immediate comfort. The paper felt impossibly soft against their calloused, cracked skin. If they closed their eyes and brought the envelope close to their faces, they could sometimes catch the faintest ghost of a scent, a lingering trace of lavender soap, the dusty, familiar smell of a wooden attic, or the sweet, sharp aroma of pipe tobacco. It was the smell of a world that made sense. It was the aroma of safety. They retreated into the deepest, most sheltered corners of their dugouts to read. A tiny, precious candle stub would be lit, its golden flame trembling in the slight draught, casting long, dancing shadows against the ice-covered dirt. They opened the envelopes with a tender, agonizing slowness, terrified that their numb fingers might tear the precious words inside. The handwriting on the pages was a bridge across an unimaginable distance. A young man, barely out of his teens, sat with his knees pulled tightly to his chest to preserve whatever meager heat his body still possessed. His breath plumed white in the freezing air as his eyes traced the elegant, looping script of his mother. She wrote to him of the first winter frost in their village. She described sitting in her favorite upholstered armchair, pulled close to the large, tiled stove that radiated a deep, gentle, and continuous heat through the whole house. She wrote of baking sweet winter breads, describing how the rich smell of cinnamon, nutmeg, and rising yeast filled the warm kitchen air. "We are keeping the house so warm for you," her letter read, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. "The fire in the hearth is always lit. I have set your heavy woolen slippers right by the rug, just waiting for your tired feet to step through the door." The boy read these words while sitting on a block of solid, unforgiving ice. He could not feel his own toes inside his rigid, frozen boots. The contrast was a heavy, physical ache in his chest. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking agony. To imagine that roaring fire, to almost feel its radiant heat pressing against his face, was a profound mercy, yet it made the surrounding dark of the dugout feel infinitely colder. He closed his eyes and let the phantom warmth of his mother's kitchen wash over him, a temporary exile from the freezing world. In another corner of the trench, an older soldier read a letter from his wife. She wrote cheerfully of their young children, describing how they had run out into the small garden behind their house to catch the light, fluffy snowflakes on their tongues. She painted a picture of a gentle, playful winter, a season of sledding down gentle, familiar hills and coming inside for cups of warm milk and honey. "The snow is so pretty here this year," she wrote in her delicate, careful hand. "It covers the garden like a soft, white blanket. We look out the window at it and we think of you, wondering if you are seeing the same beautiful snow, wondering if you are resting peacefully tonight." He paused, lowering the letter to his lap, and looked out at the entrance of his dugout. The snow here was not a blanket. It was an ocean of frozen iron. It was a relentless, howling force that buried machines, silenced entire forests, and threatened to swallow them whole. But he did not feel any anger at her innocent, gentle words. Instead, he felt a fierce, quiet, and protective gratitude. He was incredibly glad, down to the very marrow of his freezing bones, that she did not know the truth. He was thankful that her winter was still a thing of beauty and childhood joy. He would gladly endure this unimaginable ice, this sheer, biting terror of the steppe, so that she would never have to understand what a truly frozen world felt like. He smiled softly in the dim light, tracing her name with a numb thumb, fiercely guarding her innocence with his silence. Not every man received a letter. For those who sat with empty hands, staring blankly at the sparkling frost on the dirt walls, the quiet hum of the dugout could be a very lonely sound. The isolation of the winter was heavy, and to be forgotten by the mail cart was a quiet, devastating blow. But in this frozen purgatory, the bonds of brotherhood were stronger than the ice. A soldier who had just finished reading a long, cheerful letter from his younger sister would gently fold the pages, look over at his silent, staring companion, and softly offer a piece of his home. "My sister says the apples in the orchard were particularly sweet this year," he would whisper in the gloom, leaning closer so his voice wouldn't be lost to the wind outside. "She made 3 dozen jars of preserves. She says hello, by the way. She asks if you are keeping your ears warm, and she says there is a jar of apple butter waiting for you when we get back. It was a small, graceful lie. A tiny fabrication born of pure, profound kindness. He shared the warmth of his family's kitchen with a man who had none. He offered the sweet memory of a sunlit apple orchard to a brother who was starving for a single drop of comfort. They would sit together, sharing the phantom heat of a distant stove, their shoulders pressed tight against one another, listening to the gentle cadence of reading voices drifting through the dark trench. And then came the solemn ritual of writing back. It was a monumental, agonizing task. The ink in their fountain pens had long since frozen solid, expanding and shattering the fragile glass tubes inside. They relied on tiny stubs of lead pencils, but even guiding a wooden pencil required a dexterity that the cold had cruelly stolen from them. They had to warm the lead by holding it in their mouths, breathing life and heat into the wood before pressing it to the stiff, freezing paper. They wrote by the dying, flickering light of the candle, their breath pluming over the pages, their shadows dancing on the ice walls. The words they sent back were brave, beautiful shields. They wrote of the quiet camaraderie among the men, the stark, peaceful beauty of the starry winter nights, and the gentle hope of the coming spring. They did not write of the frostbite creeping silently up their limbs. They did not write of the terrifying silence of the frozen engines, or the way the steppe wind sounded like a chorus of mourning ghosts. They crafted gentle, reassuring stories. A son promised his mother he was eating well and wearing his heavy scarf. A husband promised his wife he was sleeping soundly beneath a thick roof. They packed all their love, all their quiet resilience, and all their desperate longing into a few folded pages, sending their hearts back to the warm, bright living rooms they missed so intensely. When the reading and writing were finally done, and the tiny candle was gently blown out to save the precious wax for tomorrow, the dugout plunged back into absolute, heavy darkness. The letters were not placed in their heavy canvas packs, nor were they left in the pockets of their greatcoats. They were tucked carefully inside their tunics, slipped beneath the layers of rough wool and unwashed cotton, resting directly against their skin, right over their beating hearts. It was a deeply physical gesture of longing and preservation. In the freezing, silent night, with the wind howling its endless, lonely psalm across the frozen earth above them, those thin pieces of paper felt like glowing, magical embers. They radiated a gentle, invisible warmth that no ice could penetrate. As the soldiers closed their weary eyes, shivering together in the dark, they held onto those words. They let the memory of the tiled stoves, the smell of the cinnamon bread, and the soft, safe snow of their hometowns carry them far away from the desolate steppe. The letters were their armor against the despair, their quietest, most beautiful rebellion against the freezing world, rocking them gently into a dream of home until the pale, icy dawn broke once again. To see the very end of a journey, yet know your tired feet can carry you no further, is a quiet and beautiful kind of heartbreak. The morning broke over the steppe not with a warm glow, but with a pale, silvery light that simply diluted the heavy dark. The sky was a vast, unbroken sheet of pearlescent gray, hanging low and heavy over a world that had been swallowed entirely by the snow. The wind had finally paused its endless, morning song, leaving behind a stillness that was both peaceful and profoundly absolute. A small group of men stood near the crest of a gentle, snow-covered ridge. They moved with a slow, agonizing stiffness, their bodies wrapped in every thin layer of cloth they possessed, resembling fragile, wandering ghosts against the stark white landscape. They had walked for months. They had marched through the golden dust, waded through the oceans of autumn mud, and survived the sudden, silencing drop of the deep winter freeze. And now, standing on this quiet rise, the very edge of their long, impossible dream finally revealed itself. An older soldier, his face entirely hidden behind a woolen scarf crusted with the frost of his own breath, slowly raised a pair of heavy metal binoculars to his eyes. His hands, encased in torn, stiff mittens, trembled slightly, not just from the biting cold, but from a quiet, swelling anticipation. The glass lenses were clouded with a delicate lattice of ice. With extraordinary, tender care, he pulled a relatively dry corner of a rag from his tunic and wiped the lenses clean, terrified of scratching the glass, terrified of blurring the vision that awaited him. He lifted the heavy iron to his face once more, the freezing metal pressing sharply against his numb cheekbones, and he looked out across the vast, wide ocean toward the east. At first, there was only the familiar, endless expanse of the snowdrifts, rolling away like frozen waves. But as he adjusted the small, grooved wheel, the blurry gray haze of the horizon slowly, miraculously began to sharpen. The soft, chaotic shapes of the wilderness gave way to the unmistakable, deliberate lines of human hands. There, suspended in the hazy winter light, were the outskirts of the White City. It was not a rumor anymore. It was not a story whispered around a dying fire to keep the creeping despair at bay. It was real. He could see the sharp, dark silhouettes of rooftops. He could see the tall, proud chimneys reaching up into the pale sky. And there, catching a faint, fleeting glimmer of the morning light, the soft curve of a distant spire. The soldier lowered the binoculars very slowly, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring across the snow. His breath caught softly in his chest. For months, Moscow had been a mythical destination, a beautiful fairy tale constructed from exhaustion and hope. They had imagined it as a place of infinite warmth, of heavy wooden doors and roaring hearths. And now, it was right there. It was so incredibly close. This proximity was a cruel and beautiful trick of the winter air. In the warm, golden days of summer, the distance between the ridge and those distant spires would have been nothing more than a pleasant afternoon stroll. A man could have walked it with his hands in his pockets, listening to the birds, and been comfortably seated in a warm room before the sun went down. Through the magnified glass, it looked as though you could simply reach out and touch the heavy stone walls. It looked as though, if you listened closely enough, you might hear the muffled sound of a city waking up, or the clinking of teacups in a warm, distant parlor. But the body knows what the eyes try to forget. Between the quiet men on the ridge and the beautiful, sleeping city lay an impenetrable fortress of winter. The snow in the shallow valleys ahead was piled high, whipped by the wind into towering, impassable drifts that could swallow a man whole. The air between them was a physical, freezing weight that sucked the warmth from their blood with every step. The winter had built a magnificent, silent wall of glass and ice, entirely indifferent to their exhaustion, entirely unyielding to their desires. The veteran soldier turned, his movements slow and reverent, and offered the binoculars to the young boy standing beside him. He did not say a word. He simply nodded toward the east. The boy took the heavy metal glasses, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold them steady to his eyes. He leaned forward, squinting through the cold glass. When the blurry shapes finally resolved into the dark rooftops and the faint, distant spires, a soft, trembling sigh escaped his lips. It was a sound of profound relief, mixed with a deep, crushing sorrow. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye. It traced a warm, fragile path down his dirty cheek before freezing entirely solid against his skin, a tiny pearl of ice caught in the biting wind. He continued to look, unable to tear his gaze away from the promise of warmth that was so close, yet so agonizingly out of reach. He imagined the people inside those buildings. He wondered if they were sitting by their stoves, watching the snow fall against the glass of their windows. He felt an intense, overwhelming longing simply to be indoors, to know the feeling of a roof above his head and a floor beneath his feet. The agony of being this close to comfort, while standing in an absolute, freezing void, was a weight almost too heavy for his young heart to bear. The veteran reached out and placed a heavy, gloved hand gently on the boy's shoulder. It was a small, quiet gesture of profound understanding. He squeezed softly, a silent tether in the freezing wind. "I know," the touch seemed to say. "I see it too. I feel it too." They stood together in the snow, a line of weary, frozen men taking turns looking through the glass, sharing a quiet, collective heartbreak. They did not speak of the impossible snowdrifts. They did not speak of the numbness creeping up their legs, or the way the freezing air burned their lungs. In that brief, silent moment on the ridge, they allowed themselves only to look at the beauty of the destination they had sacrificed so much to see. When the pale sun began to sink, pulling the long, gray shadows across the snow and plunging the world back into the terrifying dark, they slowly retreated to the icy shelter of their dugouts. They huddled together in the gloom, pulling their thin blankets up to their chins, seeking the meager, shared warmth of their freezing bodies. The tiny, precious candle was lit, casting its weak, golden glow against the frosted dirt walls. Out came the battered notebooks. Out came the tiny stubs of pencil, warmed carefully between trembling lips. The letters written that night were touched with a strange, bittersweet peace. They did not write of the despair. They did not write of the agonizing realization that the march had permanently stalled, or that the wall of winter could not be breached. They protected their families from the crushing weight of the cold, offering them instead the beautiful, fleeting vision from the ridge. A soldier, his hands curled inward to capture the tiny heat of the candle, wrote to his wife. "My darling," his careful, jagged handwriting spelled out on the stiff paper. "Today, I stood on a small hill, and I looked through the glass. I saw the city. I saw the spires and the roofs, waiting quietly in the snow. It is a beautiful place. It is exactly as we dreamed it would be when we started this long walk in the summer. I want you to know that we have made it. We have seen the end of the road." He paused, resting his heavy head against the frozen wall behind him, closing his eyes. "The air is very cold tonight," he continued, keeping his words soft and gentle, "but the sight of those buildings warmed me. I thought of our own roof and our own windows. Please, keep the fire burning bright. When you look into the hearth, know that I am looking at a city of warmth, and that I am thinking only of you." He folded the letter delicately, pressing it over his heart, a quiet, brave surrender to the reality of the step. As the candle flickered and died, leaving the men in absolute, freezing darkness, the wind outside began to howl once more, sweeping fresh snow over their tracks, building the white wall higher and higher. But as the exhausted men drifted into a shivering, troubled sleep, the image of the white city remained entirely clear in their minds. They saw the dark roofs. They saw the golden spires catching the light. It was a beautiful, haunting lullaby that sang them to sleep in the deep ice. They were separated from the warmth by an ocean of winter, but in the quiet, secret space of their dreams, they finally stepped out of the cold, walked through those heavy doors, and found their way home. Out of the swirling, endless white void, the snow itself seemed to rise and quietly begin to walk. The blizzards of that deep winter did not roar with the fury of a sudden storm. They hummed with a low, constant, and hypnotic vibration that swallowed the world whole. For days, the sky and the earth had been erased, blending into a single, blinding canvas of pure, unbroken white. The horizon was gone. The trees were gone. To stand in the shallow, frozen trenches was to stand inside a heavy, waking dream, where the only reality was the biting wind and the agonizing, rhythmic shivers of the men beside you. The sentries who stood watch at the very edge of the encampment were lonely figures, wrapped in whatever filthy, torn rags they could find, their thin summer coats stiff with weeks of accumulated ice. They peered out into the howling vale, their eyelashes heavy with frost, their eyes aching from the relentless glare of the blowing snow. In this profound and sensory isolation, the mind begins to seek comfort in gentle illusions. A tired soldier, his feet entirely numb inside his frozen boots, might stare into the drifting flakes and see the shape of a familiar house, or the ghostly outline of a warming fire, only to watch it dissolve back into the wind a moment later. But on this particular, terrifying morning, the shapes in the snow did not dissolve. It began as a subtle, almost imperceptible shifting in the curtain of the blizzard. A sentry, his face wrapped tightly in a woolen scarf, blinked his heavy eyes, thinking the exhaustion was finally taking its ultimate toll. He saw movement. But it was not the dark, sharp silhouette of an approaching army. It was white moving against white. It was a fluid, silent progression, a gentle detachment of shadows from the deeper shadows of the storm. They made no sound. The great, mechanical heart of the German army had long since frozen solid, leaving behind a profound silence, and the men who now emerged from the blizzard honored that absolute quiet. They did not march with the heavy, crunching rhythm of leather boots on ice. Instead, they seemed to glide, skimming over the surface of the deep, impassable drifts with a smooth, terrifying grace. They were on skis, their movements perfectly attuned to the rhythm of the wind, moving like pale phantoms across an ocean of frost. To the exhausted men in the trenches, it felt as though the winter itself had finally taken human form. These were the newly arrived defenders from the deep, vast East, men who had been born in the snow and raised in the shadow of the great, freezing forests. And to the shivering, starving soldiers who watched them approach, the contrast was a quiet, crushing shock. The men in the trenches were dressed in the ghosts of summer, thin cotton tunics, tattered gloves, and boots that had turned to blocks of iron. But the figures emerging from the whiteout were draped in the heavy, warm embrace of the season. They wore thick, quilted jackets that held the heat of their bodies close. On their feet were soft, heavy boots of compacted felt, designed not just to trap warmth, but to muffle every footfall, allowing them to walk upon the snow without ever breaking its fragile crust. And over all of this, they wore flowing cloaks of pure white cotton, hoods pulled low over their faces, rendering them almost completely invisible against the storm. They were ghosts in white, spirits of the ice, born from the very landscape that the invaders were so desperately trying to survive. The psychological toll of this sight was profound. For months, the men had been fighting the cold, believing it was an indifferent, mindless enemy. But to see men moving comfortably through the heart of the blizzard, to see them using the deadly, freezing wind as a shield and a cloak, broke something fragile inside the weary minds of the centuries. It was a dawning, terrifying realization that they were not just fighting an army of men, they were fighting the very nature of the land itself. In the shallow dugout, the sentry did not shout. He did not raise his rifle or call out a harsh alarm. His fingers were too numb, and his heart was too heavy with awe and quiet dread. Instead, he stepped back slowly, his frozen boots scraping softly against the icy floor of the trench. He reached out and gently touched the shoulder of his companion, who was huddled beneath a thin blanket, drifting in a dangerous, freezing sleep. "Wake up," the sentry whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the hiss of the wind. "Please, wake up. They are here." The younger boy stirred, his face pale and drawn, opening his eyes to the dim, gray light of the trench. He saw the sheer, unearthly terror in his friend's eyes, and he did not ask questions. In that small, quiet moment, a profound act of everyday heroism unfolded. The young boy did not panic. He simply reached out and took his older friend's trembling, frostbitten hand in his own. He squeezed it tightly, offering the very last ounce of his own courage. Together, they slowly stood up, leaning against the frozen dirt wall, and looked out over the parapet into the swirling white. They watched the ghosts approach. It was a surreal, almost beautiful choreography. The white-clad figures wove through the heavy drifts, appearing and disappearing as the wind pulsed and faded. They were completely at home in the void. There were no barking orders, no clanking of metal equipment. There was only the soft, rhythmic shush of wooden skis sliding over the powder, a sound so peaceful it belonged in a winter resort, not on the edge of a frozen battlefield. The sheer, overwhelming realization of their own vulnerability washed over the men in the trench. They were strangers in a land that was actively trying to expel them, while these new defenders were the land's own children, welcomed and hidden by the snow. When the brief, ethereal encounters ended, and the ghosts melted back into the blizzard as silently as they had come, leaving behind only shallow, parallel tracks that the wind quickly erased, the men in the trenches collapsed back into their dugouts. Their hearts beat with a frantic, hollow rhythm. They pulled their knees to their chests, rocking gently in the dark, trying to convince themselves that what they had just seen was real. Later, in the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the cold was so intense it felt as though it might crack the very sky, the fragile notebooks were pulled from the innermost pockets of their tunics. Writing was an agony of stiff joints and fading light, but it was the only way to process the surreal nightmare of the day. A soldier, the same sentry who had first spotted the movement in the snow, warmed the stub of his pencil between his cracked lips. He shielded the tiny, flickering flame of a match with his body, casting a warm, brief glow over the stiff paper. He was writing to his wife, seeking the comfort of her memory to anchor him to the real world. He could not tell her the absolute truth. He could not tell her that the enemy had become invisible, that they were being hunted by men who felt no cold and made no sound. It would terrify her beyond all comfort. So, he softened the reality. He wrapped his fear in poetry, trying to explain the unexplainable through a gentle, melancholy lens. "The winter here is so strange, my love," he wrote, his jagged handwriting pressing deeply into the page. "It plays tricks on our tired eyes. Today, out in the heavy snow, we saw men dressed entirely in white. They moved so softly, like the angels you used to tell the children about when the first snows fell at home. They wore thick white coats and glided over the drifts. It is a beautiful and terrible thing to see. It makes me realize how far away from our own fires we have traveled." He paused, his breath pluming in the dark, imagining her reading these words in their quiet, warm sitting room. He wanted her to feel the mystery of the landscape, but not the terror of it. "Do not be afraid for me," he continued, knowing it was a gentle lie. "We are looking out for each other. Hans and I share our watch, and we share our blankets. But the men in white, they belong to the snow. They do not shiver as we do. I close my eyes now and think of your hands, and how warm they always felt when you held mine. Please, hold on to my memory by the fire, so that I might not fade entirely into the white." He folded the letter with immense, trembling care. It was a fragile record of a world turned upside down, a world where the snow had teeth and the blizzards hid silent, gliding phantoms. He tucked it safely against his chest, right over his slowly beating heart, seeking the phantom warmth of her love. As the wind continued to howl above the dugout, burying them deeper and deeper beneath the drifts, the men huddled closer together. They listened to the deep, resonant silence that lay just beneath the screaming wind. They knew now that they were not alone in the vast, freezing emptiness. The White City was guarded by the spirits of the winter itself, and as the exhausted men drifted into a fitful, shivering sleep, they prayed quietly that the snow would not rise and walk again. The cruelest distance in the world is not 1,000 miles, but the final, frozen steps you can see but cannot take. For so long, the march had been driven by the sheer, unyielding rhythm of forward motion. Even through the dust, through the mud, and through the early snows, there was always the comfort of progress. A feeling that every heavy footfall brought them closer to a destination, closer to a roof, closer to rest. But as the true, deep winter settled its immense weight upon the land, that rhythm slowly, agonizingly died away. The great, sweeping advance of the summer had been reduced to a fragile, shivering crawl. And then, against the howling breath of the steppe, it simply stopped. They were so close. That was the quiet, profound tragedy that haunted every waking moment and every restless, freezing dream. Just a few miles away, hidden behind the impenetrable curtain of the blowing snow, the White City waited. When the wind shifted, dropping its howling pitch to a soft, mournful sigh, it would carry a scent that tore at the hearts of the exhausted men. It was the faint, unmistakable smell of wood smoke. It was the scent of thousands of chimneys exhaling the warm, comforting perfume of burning birch and coal into the winter sky. To a man standing in an open field, his body trembling so violently that he can no longer feel his own hands, the smell of a distant fire is a beautiful, agonizing torture. They would stand in their shallow trenches, their faces wrapped in rags that were stiff with the ice of their own breath, and close their eyes. They would breathe in that faint smoke, and their minds would instantly paint vivid, heartbreaking pictures of the rooms where those fires burned. They imagined brick hearths glowing with orange and red embers. They pictured heavy iron stoves radiating a deep, continuous heat that could melt the ice from a pair of boots in minutes. They saw families sitting around wooden tables, bathed in the soft, golden light of lamps, protected from the dark and the cold by thick stone walls and heavy, velvet curtains. To be this close to salvation, to be able to smell the warmth and see the faint, smudged glow of the city lights against the heavy night sky, was a psychological burden almost too heavy to carry. If they had been stranded 1,000 miles away, in the middle of a nameless, empty wilderness, the cold would have simply been a natural enemy. But to freeze on the very doorstep of a warm house made the winter feel deeply, intimately cruel. It felt as though the White City was a beautiful, locked room, and they had been left outside on the porch to quietly fade away into the snow. Every attempt to move forward now felt like pushing against a solid, invisible wall. The wind blew constantly from the east, an endless, freezing tide that battered their faces and pushed against their chests. To gain a single yard of ground required a monumental, exhausting effort. Men would lean entirely forward, wrapping their arms around their own bodies, fighting for breath in air that was so thin and sharp it burned their lungs like inhaled glass. In this agonizing crawl, the landscape of their ambition shrank. They no longer spoke of capturing the great city. They no longer spoke of grand victories or historical moments. Their universe narrowed to the most immediate, desperate goals. Just to that ruined fence. Just to the edge of that frozen grove of trees. Just 10 more steps before we sit down in the snow. It was in this space of fading hope that the most profound and quiet acts of everyday heroism blossomed. When a man's spirit finally broke under the weight of the wind, he did not cry out. He would simply stop walking. He would look down at the pristine, inviting snow, feeling a sudden, overwhelming urge to just lie down and go to sleep. But he was never allowed to fall alone. A companion, a boy whose own face was pale and hollowed by starvation and frost, would step softly to his side. He would not shout, for there was no energy left for anger. He would gently slide his arm under the freezing man's shoulder, taking half his weight. He would lean his head close, speaking in a soft, rhythmic whisper that served as a lullaby of survival. "I have you," he would murmur, his breath a white mist in the freezing air. "Do not look at the city. Do not look at the horizon. Just look at my boots. Just watch the snow fall by my boots, and step where I step." They moved together like slow, fragile statues, bound by an unbreakable thread of love and shared suffering. If one man stumbled, the other braced him. If one man could no longer hold his rifle, the other took it from his frozen hands and slung it across his own aching back. They gave each other the very last crumbs of their strength, simply to buy one more minute of life in the freezing void. When the evening finally cast its dark, heavy blanket over the steppe, the forward movement ceased completely. They dug into the snow drifts, carving out tiny, icy caves to hide from the wind. They huddled together in the pitch black, their bodies pressed so tightly against one another that they could feel each other's hearts beating, slow and fragile in the chest. In these dark, frozen hollows, the realization began to settle over them like a quiet, falling snow. The momentum was gone. The grand push was over. The beautiful, glowing hearts of the White City were going to remain forever out of their reach. It was not a sudden panic, but a slow, peaceful surrender to a reality they could no longer fight. The land had asked them to stop, and they were finally, deeply, irrevocably tired enough to listen. By the light of a single, carefully guarded match, shielded by 5 pairs of trembling, frostbitten hands, a soldier pulled out his tattered notebook. The paper was so cold it felt like a sheet of thin glass. He warmed the tip of his wooden pencil between his cracked lips, closed his eyes for a moment to summon the memory of a warm room, and began to write to his family. He did not write of the failure. He did not write of the agony of smelling the distant wood smoke, or the way the wind seemed to push them backward with giant, invisible hands. He wanted to leave them with a gentle memory, a soft thought to hold on to when they sat by their own fire. "My dearest ones," he wrote, the pencil scratching softly in the quiet dark. "The snow has fallen very deep tonight, and the wind is singing a loud song across the fields. We have stopped our walking. The great city is just ahead of us. We can see the shadows of its buildings against the sky, but the winter has closed the roads, and we must wait. He paused, resting his heavy head against the frozen shoulder of the man sleeping beside him. He pictured the sitting room of his own home. He pictured the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the sleeping dog curled on the braided rug by the fire, the smell of roasted chestnuts and old books. "I am so very tired," he continued, his handwriting small and careful, holding back the vastness of his despair. "But I am not alone. We are keeping each other company in the dark. We share our blankets, and we talk of home. Please, put another log on the fire for me tonight. Sit close to the hearth, and know that I am thinking of its warmth. The city here is close to us, but the memory of our home is a fire that the winter cannot put out." He folded the letter with a tender, agonizing slowness. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking acceptance of his fate. He tucked the paper deep beneath his layers of filthy wool, pressing it against his chest. He hoped that the words, born of love and longing, might carry some small fragment of warmth, a tiny ember to keep his heart beating through the endless night. Outside, the wind howled its victory song, whipping the snow into towering, impassable drifts, building the wall of winter higher and thicker between the exhausted men and the distant, glowing spires. But inside the dark, icy dugout, there was only a quiet, peaceful stillness. The men closed their eyes, leaning against one another, their breathing falling into a slow, synchronized rhythm. The dream of the White City slowly faded from their minds, replaced by the gentle, comforting visions of their own faraway hearths. They wrapped themselves in the memory of warmth, holding fast to the quiet heroism of brotherhood, and allowed the deep, indifferent sleep of the Russian winter to rock them gently in the dark. When the iron hearts of the great machines finally stopped beating, the survival of an entire army fell upon the quiet, patient shoulders of the horses. The silence that swept over the frozen steppe was profound and absolute. The heavy transport trucks, the sleek cars, the armored beasts that had roared across the continent with such terrifying confidence, all of them had been silenced by the deep, indifferent freeze of the Russian winter. They sat along the snow-draped roads like ancient, forgotten monuments, their engines cracked, their wheels locked entirely in tombs of solid ice. The modern age had shattered against the cold, leaving behind a stillness so vast it felt as though the world itself had stopped turning. In this vast and freezing void, the men were forced to step back in time. They were stripped of their engines and their speed, left with nothing but their own two aching feet, and the gentle, breathing companions that had walked quietly beside them all along. These were the draft horses. They were magnificent, sturdy creatures, born in the quiet, rolling valleys and peaceful farmsteads of a faraway homeland. They had been raised to pull wooden plows through soft, dark earth in the springtime, or to carry wagons of golden hay beneath the warm summer sun. They were not creatures of the ice. Yet, here they were, hundreds of miles from the gentle pastures they knew, standing knee-deep in the blinding white drifts of the endless steppe. As the machines died, the bond between the soldiers and these gentle animals deepened into something profoundly beautiful and quietly tragic. The men realized, with a heavy and sobering clarity, that their lives were now entirely tethered to the rhythmic, steaming breath of the beasts beside them. To watch a horse struggle through the deep snow is to witness a heartbreaking display of silent, uncomplaining nobility. The snow was often chest-high, a heavy, powdery ocean that offered no solid footing. The horses would lean their massive shoulders into their heavy leather collars, their heads bowed low against the biting wind. Their breath plumed in great, thick clouds of white mist that instantly froze, coating their long eyelashes and their soft whiskers in delicate, heavy icicles. Their beautiful coats, once glossy and brushed, were now matted with frost and sweat that turned to ice the moment they stopped moving. They pulled the wooden supply carts, the field kitchens, the wagons carrying the sick and the wounded. They pulled until their muscles trembled and their great hearts pounded against their ribs. And through it all, they never cried out. They simply offered the quiet, steady rhythm of their hooves, giving every ounce of their vast, generous strength to the men who walked beside them. The soldiers did not look upon these animals merely as beasts of burden. In the terrifying isolation of the winter, the horses became brothers. They became the very heartbeats of the marching columns. When a wagon became hopelessly mired in a deep, hidden drift, the men no longer reached for whips or shouted in frustration. They knew the horses were giving all they had. Instead, the men would wade into the waist-deep snow, their own legs numb and trembling, to stand beside the struggling animals. They would place their freezing, mittened hands gently against the horse's warm, damp neck, murmuring soft words of encouragement, whispering into the velvet ears. "We pull together now," a young boy might whisper to his horse, pressing his cheek against the animal's frost-covered mane. "Just one more step, my friend. Just one more. I am right here with you." And then, the men would put their own frail, exhausted shoulders to the heavy wooden wheels. Man and beast would strain together, their breaths mingling in the freezing air, united in a desperate, physical prayer against the snow. When the wagon finally lurched free, the soldier would not step away. He would stay close to the horse's side, resting a hand on its flank, drawing comfort from the steady, rhythmic warmth of the animal's heavy breathing. In the desperate, freezing reality of the march, small moments of quiet heroism unfolded around the animals every single day. Rations were agonizingly scarce, and the endless fields of grass were buried beneath feet of solid ice, leaving the horses with almost nothing to eat. The men, themselves hollow-cheeked and starving, could not bear to see their quiet companions suffer. A soldier would carefully save his own meager ration of black bread. When the evening halt was called, and the wind began its mournful howling through the bare birch trees, he would pull off his thick glove. He would break the hard, frozen bread into small pieces, holding them tightly in his own mouth for a moment to soften the crust with his breath, before offering them on the flat of his bare, trembling palm. The horse would reach out with a soft, warm muzzle, its breath blooming against the soldier's freezing skin, and gently take the offering. That brief, tender touch, the velvet softness of the animal's nose against a numb, cracked hand, was a profoundly beautiful connection. It was a spark of pure, uncomplicated love in a world that had become impossibly harsh. As the night descended, plunging the temperature even deeper into the abyss, the bond between the men and the horses became their only defense against the creeping dark. There were no barns. There were no stables to shield them from the wind. There was only the open, merciless sky and the deep, frozen earth. The men would lead their horses into the thickest groves of pine trees they could find, seeking the slight shelter of the heavy, drooping branches. They would use whatever rags and torn canvas they had left to gently wipe the ice from the horses' coats. And then, a profound and necessary surrender would take place. The soldiers did not dig separate dugouts when the horses were near. Instead, they huddled together with the animals. A man would sit in the deep snow, pulling his knees to his chest, and press his back tightly against the broad, warm flank of his horse. The great animal would stand perfectly still, acting as a massive, living shield against the biting wind. The heat radiating from the horse's body was a miracle. It was a deep, steady furnace that seeped through the soldier's thin wool coat, thawing the ice in his bones and keeping his heart beating through the longest, darkest hours. Sometimes, the horse would lower its heavy head, resting its chin gently on the soldier's shoulder, its warm breath washing over the man's freezing neck. They slept like this, leaning on one another, a fragile, intertwined sculpture of man and beast holding back the winter with nothing but their shared warmth. It was in these quiet, intimate moments, wrapped in the protective shadow of the animals, that the letters home were written. Writing was a difficult, painful chore in the dark, but the need to reach out to the warm world they had left behind was stronger than the cold. A young soldier, a boy who had grown up tending his father's quiet stables in a small village, warmed his pencil stub and rested his notebook against the front of his tunic. He leaned back against the warm belly of his draft horse, a gentle giant he had named Bastion, and he began to write to his little sister. He did not want to frighten her. He did not write about the frozen trucks, or the way the wind screamed across the ice, or the agonizing hunger that gnawed at his stomach. He focused entirely on the beauty of the animal that was keeping him alive. "My dearest little bird," he wrote, his handwriting small and careful, illuminated only by the faint, silvery starlight reflecting off the snow. "I am writing to you tonight to tell you about my new friend. His name is Bastian, and he is the bravest, most beautiful horse I have ever seen. He is a dark chestnut, just like the ones we used to watch pulling the hay wagons past our front gate in the summer." He paused, reaching up with a numb hand to gently stroke Bastian's thick, winter coat. The horse shifted slightly, letting out a soft, low sigh that sent a cloud of mist into the air. "The snow here is very deep," the letter continued, "but Bastian does not complain. He is so strong, and he walks with me every single day. I make sure to brush the snow from his mane, and in the evenings, he stands very close to me to share his warmth. It is like having a piece of our own barn here with me. When you go out to the stable tomorrow morning, please give an apple to the old mare for me, and tell her that Bastian is doing a very good job." He folded the letter delicately, a soft smile touching his cracked lips. He had painted a picture of a gentle winter adventure, a story of a boy and his faithful horse, protecting his sister's heart from the terrifying vastness of the frozen steppe. He tucked the letter away, knowing that Bastian's quiet strength was the only reason his hands were warm enough to write those words at all. As the night wore on, the camp fell into a deep, reverent silence. The machines were dead, buried beneath the drifts, their iron frozen solid and useless. But the grove was alive with the soft, comforting sounds of life. The rhythmic stamping of a hoof to keep the blood flowing. The gentle, airy snort of a horse clearing the frost from its nose. The slow, synchronized breathing of thousands of men and animals dreaming together in the dark. They were travelers from a softer world, trapped in a realm of ice, but they were not alone. The men held onto the horses, and the horses held onto the men. It was a tender, tragic reliance, a beautiful circle of care that required no words, only the shared, quiet will to survive. The soldiers closed their eyes, feeling the steady rise and fall of the great, warm chests against their backs, and surrendered to sleep, cradled safely in the ancient, loving grace of the gentle beasts. To simply take a single step can sometimes be the greatest quiet victory a human heart can achieve. The world had lost its floor. The roads, the fields, the gentle hills, and the shallow valleys had all been erased, swallowed completely by a magnificent, terrifying ocean of pure white. The snow did not just cover the earth, it rebuilt it, piling into massive, rolling dunes that shifted and breathed with the endless winter wind. In some places, the drifts reached only to the knees, but in others, they swelled as high as a man's waist, creating a soft, unyielding wall of powder and ice. To move through this landscape was not walking. It was waiting. It was a slow, agonizing swim through a frozen sea. There is a profound, heavy exhaustion that comes when the very ground you stand upon fights your every movement. In the warm, golden days of the summer march, a footstep was a thoughtless thing. The boot struck the hard earth, the leg pushed forward, and the body glided effortlessly into the next stride. But in the deep drifts of the Russian winter, a single footstep became a monumental, conscious act of sheer human will. A soldier would have to gather his waning strength just to lift his leg. His trousers, soaked through with melted snow from the days before, had frozen entirely solid, turning into stiff, heavy tubes of icy wool that resisted the bending of his knees. He would heave his heavy leather boot upward, pulling it free from the sucking vacuum of the snow beneath, and push his foot forward into the unbroken white. As he set his weight down, there was no solid earth to catch him. He would simply sink, plunging down into the freezing powder until the snow packed tightly enough beneath his soul to finally hold him. And then, he had to do it all over again. Lift, push, sink. Lift, push, sink. It was a rhythm born of absolute necessity, a slow, metronomic pendulum of survival. The physical toll was unimaginable. Every muscle in their backs and legs screamed in silent protest. Their lungs burned, pulling in air that was so incredibly thin and cold it felt like breathing in sharp, tiny needles of glass. The heavy wool coats, meant to keep them warm, became massive, suffocating burdens, dragging them down into the drifts. Yet, in this vast, quiet theater of exhaustion, the most beautiful and ordinary kind of heroism revealed itself. It did not look like the heroism of storybooks. There were no flags waving, no grand speeches ringing out across the frozen plains. It was simply the quiet, unyielding love of men refusing to let each other fall. This heroism lived most profoundly in the man at the very front of the line. To walk at the head of a column in deep snow is to offer yourself as a sacrifice for the men behind you. The point man faced the unbroken drifts alone. He had to use his own chest, his own thighs, and his own dwindling energy to carve a trench through the heavy powder. Every step he took was a battle against the virgin snow. He pushed the white walls aside with his shivering body, compacting the ice beneath his boots so that the next man would have a slightly firmer place to step. He would walk until his heart hammered against his ribs and black spots danced in his vision. He would walk until his legs simply could not lift the heavy boots one more time. And when he finally faltered, when he stepped aside, chest heaving, his face pale and glistening with freezing sweat, another man would silently step out of the line to take his place. There was no order given. There was no argument. The next soldier would simply touch the exhausted man's shoulder as he passed, a quiet, tactile whisper of gratitude, and step into the unbroken snow to take his turn breaking the trail. It was a beautiful, rhythmic rotation of shared suffering. The men behind walked carefully, deliberately placing their boots into the deep, dark footprints left by the brothers ahead of them. They moved like a single, long serpent winding through the white dunes, bound together by the physical relief of stepping into another man's path. As the hours stretched on, the sheer monotony of the struggle induced a heavy, waking trance. The mind, desperate to escape the agonizing reality of the freezing limbs, began to detach itself from the body. The men stared blankly at the back of the coat in front of them, focusing entirely on the rhythmic sway of the fabric, letting it hypnotize them into a state of numb endurance. The world narrowed down to that one piece of gray wool, and the dark, hollowed-out footprint appearing in the snow just below it. The silence of the march was profound. The snow muffled every sound, absorbing the crunch of the boots and the ragged, heavy breathing of the men. They did not speak. To speak was to waste precious warmth and air. But the silence was not empty, it was filled with a deep, telepathic connection. If the rhythm broke, if a young soldier, his eyes heavy and his legs entirely drained of life, suddenly stumbled and collapsed into the deep powder, the line did not leave him. In a world where stopping meant freezing, the men behind him would halt. They would reach down with clumsy, mittened hands, grasping the thick wool of his coat. They would pull him up, their own muscles trembling with the effort, and burst the snow from his face. Just one more step, an older soldier would whisper, his voice softer than the falling snow, leaning close so the boy could hear him over the wind. Just put your foot inside my footprint. I will make it wide for you. Just look at my boots. They would guide him forward, perhaps keeping a gentle hand on his back to steady him, lending him their balance when his own had vanished. It was an intimate, desperately quiet kind of care. They were carrying each other through the winter, measuring their lives in yards, and then in feet, and finally, simply in inches. When the sky finally began to darken, turning from a glaring, painful white to a deep, bruised purple, the forward movement would slowly cease. They did not set up a proper camp, for there was nothing left to set up. They simply collapsed into the trench they had carved through the snow, using the high, white walls they had just fought against as a meager shield from the wind. They huddled together in the deep, blue shadows of the drift, pulling their knees to their chests. They knocked their boots together, a dull, wooden sound, trying to shake the ice from the leather, trying to remind their feet that they were still attached to their bodies. In this quiet, fading light, a soldier pulled his hands deep inside his sleeves to warm his fingers. He closed his eyes, fighting the overwhelming, peaceful urge to simply drift into a sleep from which he knew he would never wake. To keep his mind anchored to the world of the living, he reached into his tunic and pulled out his small, battered notebook. He could not see the lines on the paper in the gathering dark. He wrote by feel, trusting his numb hands to remember the shapes of the letters. He was writing to his young son, a boy who had only just learned to read before the summer march began. He wanted to write something brave. He wanted to shield the boy from the terrifying vastness of the snow, from the heavy, crushing exhaustion that made grown men weep silently in the dark. My brave little man, his stiff fingers scratched across the page. The snow here is taller than you are. It is so deep and so white, it feels as though we are walking through the clouds. Today, I pretended I was an explorer, carving a path through a great, magical forest of ice. It is very hard work, and my legs are very tired, but every time I take a step, I think of you. He paused, resting his chin on his knees, shivering violently. He pictured his son in his small wooden bed, buried under thick, heavy quilts, his face warm and flushed with sleep. I want you to know, the letter continued softly, that I am walking toward you. Even when the snow is deep, and even when the wind is loud, I am putting one foot in front of the other. I am stepping through the clouds to get back to our front door. Be good for your mother, and keep your own feet warm. I am bringing you a story of the deepest snow in the world. He pressed the pencil to the paper for a long moment, sealing the promise. He folded the fragile sheet, tucking it safely over his heart, a tiny beacon of warmth in the immense, freezing night. As the stars began to pierce the heavy canopy of the sky, shining with a harsh, icy brilliance, the men in the trench fell silent. The struggle of the day was over. The deep drifts had tested the very limits of their humanity, and they had survived only by holding fast to one another. They lay in the deep snow, wrapped in each other's arms, their breathing shallow and slow. The wind swept softly over the top of their trench, carrying a fine, powdery mist that began to gently fill the footprints they had fought so hard to make. The winter was erasing their path, wiping the slate clean for the morning. But in the quiet, slumbering hearts of the men, the memory of that shared endurance remained. They closed their heavy eyes, surrendering to the profound stillness, resting their weary legs, and dreaming of a world where walking was simply a quiet stroll through a sunlit garden, far, far away from the deep and endless snow. There is a profound, fragile silence that falls when a great wave finally exhausts itself against a frozen shore. For half a year, the rhythm of the journey had been entirely defined by forward motion. It was a relentless, driving heartbeat that pushed the men across sunlit fields, through oceans of autumn mud, and deep into the labyrinth of the dark, towering pines. Even when the winter first bared its icy teeth, the momentum had carried them. The belief that they were moving toward a grand conclusion, toward the warmth of the white city, had been the invisible fuel burning in their tired chests. They had always believed that the next step, or the step after that, would finally bring an end to the marching. But on this particular, heavy winter twilight, beneath a sky the color of bruised slate and pale ash, that great, driving heartbeat simply fluttered and stopped. It did not happen all at once. There was no sudden, dramatic shout echoing across the snowy plains. There was no grand order handed down from the officers in the rear. The turning of the tide was far more delicate, and far more deeply human, than that. It was a slow, creeping realization that moved through the ranks like a soft exhale of breath in the freezing air. It began at the very front of the exhausted columns, where the men were wading through drifts so high and so densely packed by the wind that the snow felt like solid earth. A soldier, wrapped in stiff, icy rags, leaned his entire weight forward to carve out one more step. He pushed with everything he had left in his shivering frame. And then, quite suddenly, his body refused to obey. The strength drained from his legs not in a rush, but in a quiet, peaceful tide. He stopped. He lowered his heavy head, his shoulders slumping beneath the weight of his snow-covered coat, and he simply stood still in the deep drift. The man behind him took a step, bumped gently against his motionless comrade, and also stopped. And then the next man stopped. And the next. This gentle, cascading halt rippled back through the miles of frozen, winding roads. Like a great clock winding down its final seconds, the gears of the long march ceased to turn. The rhythmic crunch of thousands of boots breaking the icy crust faded away, replaced by the vast, overwhelming silence of the Russian steppe. In that profound stillness, a silent, collective understanding settled over the men. It was a heavy, invisible blanket woven from absolute exhaustion and undeniable truth. They looked out at the horizon, where the faint, hazy smudge of the city's outskirt had once promised them salvation, and they knew, with a quiet and terrifying certainty, that they were not going to reach it. The distance between where they stood and the warm hearths they had dreamed of was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in an ocean of winter that they simply did not have the strength to cross. The forward momentum was broken. The grand ambition of the summer, the maps, the compasses, the cheerful songs of the dusty roads, all of it evaporated into the biting, silvery wind. This was the delicate moment the tide turned. It was not marked by the clash of iron or the roar of conflict, but by the quiet surrender of the human body to the overwhelming majesty of nature. The winter had built a wall of ice and wind, and the men, standing in the fading gray light, finally leaned their tired heads against that wall and closed their eyes. With this realization came a profound psychological shift. The desperate desire to conquer, the need to step forward into the east, was entirely washed away. It was replaced, softly and completely, by a single, glowing ember of thought, the sheer, primal need to survive the night. The men did not panic. They were too tired for panic, and the cold had numbed the sharp edges of their fear, leaving only a dull, aching instinct to find warmth. They slowly turned away from the eastern horizon. For the first time in months, their eyes stopped searching the distance and began to search the ground immediately around them. They looked for hollows in the snowdrifts, for the sheltering roots of fallen trees, for anything that might offer a fragile barrier against the wind. In this space of suspended hope, the everyday heroism of the soldiers transformed into something profoundly intimate. They were no longer brothers in a great march. They were simply fragile humans trying to keep each other breathing in the dark. Two soldiers, a veteran with deep lines etched into his frostbitten face and a young boy who was shivering so violently his teeth chipped against each other, found a shallow depression behind a frozen supply cart. They sank into the snow together. The veteran saw the boy's hands, blue and curled inward like frozen leaves, entirely unable to grasp the edges of his thin blanket. Without a word, the older man unbuttoned the front of his own heavy greatcoat. He pulled the young boy close, wrapping the thick, stiff wool around both of their shoulders, binding them together in a tight, shivering embrace. He placed his own torn, mittened hands over the boy's bare fingers, holding them gently against his chest. "Rest now," the veteran whispered, his voice a soft, soothing rasp in the bitter air. "The walking is done for today. We do not have to go any further. Just listen to my heart, and breathe when I breathe." He gave the boy the gift of stillness. He offered his own fading body heat to a stranger, an act of pure, quiet love that defied the indifference of the freezing world around them. All across the frozen landscape, similar small, silent miracles were taking place. Men shared the last frozen crumbs of bread, pressing the food to the cracked lips of those who were too weak to chew. They took turns staying awake, gently nudging a sleeping friend if his breathing grew too shallow, pulling each other back from the peaceful, seductive edge of the freezing sleep. As the deep night fell, plunging the world into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight, the men huddled in their icy sanctuaries. The wind began to howl its mournful, ancient song, sweeping fresh snow over their tracks, burying the footprints that had led them to this lonely place. Beneath the shelter of a canvas tarp that snapped violently in the gale, a soldier fumbled with numb, agonizingly slow fingers to retrieve his small notebook. He lit a tiny, precious stub of a candle, shielding the fragile golden flame with his curved body. The light danced across the frost on his eyelashes and the icy walls of his shallow trench. He needed to write home. But the letters of this night were different from the ones that had come before. He could no longer write of the beautiful white city, or the promise of sleeping in a warm bed within a few days. The illusion had shattered, and he was left with nothing but the stark, freezing truth. Yet, even now, his deepest instinct was to protect the woman he loved from the terror of that truth. He warmed the tip of his pencil in his mouth, closed his eyes to summon her face in the dark, and began to write. My beautiful wife, the words formed slowly on the stiff, cold paper. The snow has fallen very heavily today, and the winter has grown incredibly deep. The wind has told us that it is time to rest. We have stopped our marching for now. The world is very still tonight, and the sky is filled with 1,000 bright, cold stars. He paused, a single, hot tear escaping the corner of his eye. It traced a warm line down his filthy cheek before freezing solid against his jaw. He took a slow, trembling breath, fighting to keep the despair out of his handwriting. I want you to know that I am safe, he continued, the gentle lie born of absolute devotion. I am sitting with good friends, and we are keeping the cold away together. The journey forward has paused, my love. But please, do not worry. If we cannot walk forward to the warmth, then I will simply have to find a way to bring myself back to yours. Keep the blankets thick on the bed, and leave a light in the window for me. I am no longer looking at the horizon. I am only looking toward home. He folded the letter with exquisite care, treating it as if it were made of spun glass. He slipped it beneath the layers of his frozen tunic, pressing it flat against his chest, right over the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. It was a vow made in the darkest, coldest place on earth, a promise to surrender the grand ambitions of the world in exchange for the simple, quiet privilege of holding her hand once more. The tiny candle sputtered and died, leaving the soldier in the velvet blackness of the winter night. But he was not afraid. The terrible burden of the march, the agonizing pressure to always take one more step, had been lifted from his weary shoulders. The tide had turned. The great, sweeping advance had faded into the snow, leaving behind a profound and beautiful stillness. The men leaned against one another in the dark, their breathing slow and synchronized, a fragile tapestry of life woven into the deep ice. They did not know what the morning would bring. They did not know how they would survive the vast, frozen distances that lay behind them. But for tonight, they simply allowed themselves to rest. They closed their heavy eyes, surrounded by the quiet grace of their shared survival, and let the gentle, rocking lullaby of the winter wind sing them to sleep. To turn away from the only warmth you have dreamed of, and walk back into the endless, howling dark, requires a quiet and profound kind of courage. The great, winding serpent of the marching columns, which had stretched across the vastness of the continent for so many months, was finally broken. When the momentum died and the realization settled into their freezing bones that the white city could not be reached, a gentle, disjointed confusion washed over the ranks. There was no grand bugle call to signal the turn. There were no clear paths carved through the immense, towering drifts to guide them back to where they had begun. The snow had been falling for days, a heavy, erasing blanket that had buried their footprints, buried the roads, and completely swallowed the memory of the golden summer. They were adrift in an ocean of white. The mighty army fractured, quietly and organically, dissolving into hundreds of tiny, wandering fragments. They were like fragile, glowing embers blown from a dying hearth, scattering across a vast and frozen wasteland. To retreat into a blizzard is to step into a beautifully terrifying void. The wind, which had battered their faces for so long, now pushed against their backs, a cruel, invisible hand hurrying them into the unknown. The sky and the earth were entirely indistinguishable, a swirling, hypnotic canvas of gray and silver that robbed the mind of all direction. Men walked with their heads bowed low, their shoulders hunched against the gale, their eyes half closed to protect them from the stinging, flying ice. In this frantic, disorienting wilderness, the rigid structures of the world they had left behind simply melted away. The heavy metal insignias on their collars, the quiet authority of rank, the divisions of background and birth, all of it was buried beneath the snow. In the deep, freezing dark of the retreat, a man was no longer an officer or a private. He was simply a source of heat. He was simply a brother. The survival of these small, wandering groups relied entirely upon a deep, unspoken bond forged in the absolute extreme of human endurance. They moved through the blinding storms tethered to one another by an invisible, unbreakable thread of love. You could see it in the slow, agonizing progress of their footsteps. When a small cluster of men waded through the waist-high drifts, they did not walk as individuals. They moved as a single, fragile organism. If the blinding snow caused a young boy at the front to lose his balance and tumble into the soft, freezing powder, the men behind him did not step around him. They stopped. The entire universe paused for this one fallen boy. Clumsy, mittened hands would reach down into the snow, grabbing the heavy, frozen wool of his coat, and hoist him back to his feet. There would be no reprimand, only a quiet, gentle readjustment. An older soldier, his own face hidden behind a mask of frost and rags, would silently unbuckle his heavy leather belt. He would place the boy in front of him, wrapping the end of the stiff leather around the boy's trembling hand. "Hold on to this," he would whisper, his voice completely lost in the roar of the wind, yet felt entirely in the heart. "Just hold on, and close your eyes. I will guide you. You do not need to look at the storm anymore." They formed literal chains of humanity, holding onto belts, to the tails of heavy coats, to the straps of empty canvas rucksacks, dragging each other through the blinding void. They became each other's eyes, each other's balance, each other's will to take just one more agonizing step. When the pale, watery light of the brief winter day began to fail, plunging the step into a terrifying, absolute blackness, the small groups knew they could not wander any further. To walk in the dark was to walk off the edge of the world. They had to find shelter, but there was no shelter to be found. There were no ruins, no forests, no hollows, only the flat, screaming ice. And so, they built their sanctuaries out of one another. They would find a small depression in the snow, a place where the wind seemed just a fraction less cruel, and they would gather together. This was the ritual of the embers. They moved with a slow, sacred geometry, forming tight, overlapping circles in the deep snow. The mechanics of this huddle were an act of pure, selfless grace. The men who were the strongest, those who still had a lingering spark of vitality in their freezing limbs, would voluntarily take the outer ring. They would sit with their backs to the howling wind, offering their own bodies as a living wall of wool and flesh to break the gale. And into the very center of this circle, they placed the weakest. The boys who were weeping silently from the pain of their frostbitten toes. The men whose eyes had grown dark and hollow with starvation. They pulled their knees tightly to their chests, tucked their chins beneath their stiff collars, and pressed themselves together until there was no space left between them. In the pitch-black heart of the blizzard, buried beneath the falling snow, they pooled their meager, fading body heat. It was a miracle of shared survival. The warmth of a dozen freezing men, trapped within a fortress of heavy coats, created a tiny, fragile bubble of life in the center of the ice. They leaned their heavy heads upon the shoulders of the men beside them. They listened to the slow, ragged breathing of their brothers, finding a soothing, hypnotic comfort in the shared rhythm. If a man on the outer edge began to shiver too violently, his body surrendering to the cold, the circle would quietly, gently shift. The men would open their formation, pull the freezing man into the warm center, and another would silently take his place in the biting wind. It was a beautiful, endless rotation of sacrifice, a quiet ballet of everyday heroism performed in the absolute dark. In the center of one such huddle, entirely shielded from the screaming storm by the backs of his friends, a soldier reached into his tunic with trembling, numb fingers. He could not see anything, the darkness was absolute. But he knew the shape of his small, battered notebook by heart. He found the tiny, wooden stub of his pencil, warming it carefully in his mouth. He could not write a real letter, for there was no mail cart in this disjointed wilderness, and no light to see the page. But in his mind, and with the gentle, blind scratching of the lead against the paper, he composed his thoughts to his wife. He needed to speak to her. He needed to anchor his fading spirit to the warm, bright memory of her face. He did not tell her that they were retreating. He did not tell her that the Grand Army had shattered into lost, freezing fragments, or that he was currently buried beneath the snow, kept alive only by the body heat of the strangers pressed against him. He protected her from the terror of the blizzard, offering her a story of hope instead. "My beautiful love," he traced the invisible words in the dark. "The wind has changed its direction today. It is no longer blowing in our faces, it is pushing against our backs. We have turned around. The journey forward is over, and now, every single step I take is a step that brings me closer to our front door." He paused, resting his cheek against the rough, icy wool of the coat next to him, letting a slow, trembling breath escape his lips. He imagined her sitting in their parlor, knitting by the light of a warm, oil lamp. "The snow is very heavy tonight," his unseen letter continued, "but you must not worry for me. I am sitting with my brothers. We have built a small fire of our own, made of quiet friendship and shared blankets. We are keeping each other safe. Please, make sure the heavy quilt is on the bed, and leave the porch light burning. The road is long, and the nights are so very dark, but I am finally walking toward you. I am coming home." He folded the small piece of paper with agonizing care, entirely in the dark, and slipped it back over his heart. The gentle, beautiful lie warmed him from the inside out. He had reframed the frantic, terrifying retreat into a romantic journey back to her arms. It was a fragile illusion, but in the heart of a Russian blizzard, an illusion of warmth is sometimes enough to keep a man breathing until the dawn. Outside their huddled circle, the blizzard raged on. The wind screamed across the endless white plains, piling the snow higher and higher, burying the silent landscape in a tomb of ice. But beneath the drifts, the small, quiet embers refused to go out. The men held fast to one another, their arms locked, their bodies completely intertwined. They did not speak, for words were unnecessary. They communicated entirely through the gentle pressure of a shoulder, the shared warmth of a breath, the steady, rhythmic beating of a heart pressed against a back. They were bound by a profound, sacred brotherhood, relying entirely on the man beside them to survive the freezing dark. And as they drifted into a shallow, shivering sleep, cradled in the protective center of their human hearth, they knew that as long as they held onto each other, the winter could not entirely claim them. To turn one's back on a dream is a heavier burden than carrying it across a continent. For so many long, agonizing months, the compass of their hearts had pointed entirely in one direction. Every step taken through the golden dust of summer, every desperate push through the oceans of autumn mud, and every shivering, breathless stumble through the freezing blizzards had been drawn by the magnetic pull of the east. The White City was the anchor of their endurance. It was the beautiful, glowing promise that gave meaning to their suffering. To reach it was to find warmth, to find rest, and to find the end of the long road. But now, beneath a sky of pale, unforgiving gray, the compass was quietly broken. The order to turn back did not sweep through the frozen ranks with the sharp, clear ring of a bugle. It moved like a heavy, mournful sigh carried on the biting wind. It was a slow, physical shifting of thousands of exhausted bodies, a collective, silent realization that the ultimate prize was simply going to remain forever out of reach. Standing on the crest of a gentle, snow-covered rise, a soldier stopped and slowly turned his head to the east for one final time. He was wrapped in layers of filthy, stiffened wool, his face a hollow mask of frost and fatigue. He did not raise binoculars to his eyes, he did not need to. He knew exactly where to look. There, suspended in the hazy, swirling veil of the winter light, were the faint, dark outlines of the city. The distant spires, the sweeping roofs, the places where warm fires burned safely behind thick stone walls. He stared at it, and a profound, quiet sorrow settled deep into the marrow of his freezing bones. It was not the sharp, hot sting of anger. It was a heavy, cold resignation. He thought of the unimaginable price they had paid simply to stand on this ridge and look at those distant roofs. He thought of the bright, optimistic boys who had marched beside him in the summer sun, boys whose laughter was now buried forever beneath the deep and different drifts. He thought of the magnificent draft horses that had given their great, generous hearts to pull the wagons through the ice. He thought of his own youth, of the warmth he had surrendered to the Russian winter, all of it poured out upon the earth as a tender, desperate offering for a city they could not enter. To walk away from it felt like abandoning a piece of his own soul in the snow. The physical distance between the ridge and the city had not changed, but the emotional distance had suddenly become infinite. The White City was returning to the realm of myth, a beautiful ghost fading slowly back into the blizzard. Beside him, a younger boy stood perfectly still, his wide, frost-rimmed eyes locked onto the eastern horizon. The boy's shoulders shook with a gentle, silent tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He was trapped in the agonizing gravity of the sunken cost. How could they simply leave? How could they turn away after giving so much of themselves to the journey? The boy could not find the strength to lift his heavy boot and pivot away from the dream. He was paralyzed by the sheer, heartbreaking weight of the surrender. The older soldier saw the boy's quiet agony. In this frozen, desolate landscape, the deepest acts of heroism were often the softest. He did not speak a word of reprimand. He simply reached out a thick, mittened hand and placed it gently, firmly, upon the young boy's shoulder. It was a touch of profound, tender understanding. "I know," the weight of his hand seemed to say. "I feel the exact same ache. But we cannot stay here." Slowly, with the gentle care of a father guiding a sleepwalker, the veteran applied a soft pressure to the boy's shoulder, guiding him to turn. They pivoted together in the deep snow, their boots carving slow arcs in the ice. They turned their backs on the White City. They turned their backs on the rising sun. And then, they began to walk. The sensation of walking westward was deeply disorienting, a strange and hollow mechanics of movement. For half a year, the great winds of the steppe had battered their faces, fighting their advance every inch of the way. But now, as they retraced their steps, the wind was at their backs. It pushed against their heavy coats, hurrying them along, a constant, physical reminder that the land was sweeping them away, ushering them out of its frozen heart. Without the bright, burning goal of the city to draw them forward, the march took on a new, solemn rhythm. It was the rhythm of pure, unadorned survival. The men moved with their heads bowed. Low, their eyes fixed only on the snow immediately in front of their boots. The grand ambition of the empire had vanished entirely, replaced by the simple, desperate geometry of keeping the man beside you upright and breathing. As the pale sun climbed slowly into the winter sky behind them, it cast incredibly long, thin shadows stretching out ahead of the marching columns. They followed their own ghostly silhouettes across the endless white plains, a procession of tired spirits wandering through a world that had been wiped completely clean by the snow. When the evening began to paint the sky in deep, bruised shades of violet, and the order to halt rippled softly down the line, the men sought out whatever meager shelter the landscape offered. They huddled in the frozen ruts of abandoned roads, or beneath the snow-heavy branches of solitary pines, pulling their thin blankets tight against the gathering dark. The mood in these small, shivering circles was one of profound, hushed reverence. It felt like the quiet that follows a long, solemn funeral. They did not speak of the retreat. They did not speak of the city they had left behind. They sat shoulder to shoulder, cooling their fragile body heat, finding a soothing comfort in the simple, undeniable fact that they were still alive, and that they were finally walking toward home. In the center of one of these huddled circles, shielded from the wind by the backs of his friends, a soldier drew out his tattered notebook. The pages were stiff, the edges curled and stained with the melted snow of 100 previous camps. He warmed his tiny stub of pencil between his cracked lips, closed his eyes for a moment to summon the warmth of his wife's face, and began to write. Explaining the long look back was an agonizing task. He needed to tell her that the great advance had failed, but he could not bear to burden her heart with the heavy, crushing sorrow that lay upon his own. And so, he wove the truth into a gentle, poetic reassurance. my darling," his careful handwriting scratched against the cold paper. Today, the wind changed, and so did we. We stood on a high ridge this morning, and the winter finally parted just enough for us to see the city. It was beautiful, wrapped in snow and light. We looked at it for a long time. But the winter here is an old, jealous guardian, and it has locked the doors. He paused, resting his cheek against his drawn-up knees, his breath misting softly in the dim light. He thought of the young boy he had helped turn away from the ridge, and the quiet heartbreak they had shared. "Do not be sad for us," the letter continued, full of a brave, quiet grace. "To see it was enough. We have left the city to the snow, and we have turned our faces to the west. The wind is pushing us now, helping us along. The dream of resting in those distant buildings is gone, but it has been replaced by a much warmer, much more beautiful dream. The dream of our own hearth. The dream of your hands." He pressed the pencil firmly to the page, sealing his promise to the universe. "I am walking away from the ice, my love. Every step I take now is a step back to our front door. Keep the fire burning, and know that I am bringing my heart home to you." He folded the letter with a tender, agonizing slowness, slipping it deep into his tunic, pressing it against the slow, steady rhythm of his own chest. The words were a fragile shield against the vast, empty despair of the retreat. They reminded him that while he had abandoned a city of stone and wood, he had not abandoned the love that anchored him to the world. As the deep night fell, completely erasing the horizon and plunging the steppe into a terrifying, velvety blackness, the men leaned their heavy heads against one another. They listened to the howl of the wind and the soft, rhythmic breathing of their brothers. The white city was miles behind them now, lost forever in the swirling dark. The heavy emotional weight of the long look back slowly began to lift, replaced by the hypnotic, soothing lullaby of the winter night. They were travelers on a dark and lonely road, stripped of their grand illusions, left only with the quiet, unyielding resilience of the human spirit. They closed their eyes, wrapping themselves in the shared warmth of their huddled bodies, and allowed themselves to drift into sleep, knowing that tomorrow they would rise, put one numb foot in front of the other, and continue the long, solemn journey back toward the sun. When the footsteps of 1,000 weary men finally fade away, the earth simply exhales and goes back to sleep. The great, winding columns had moved on, their backs turned to the east, their heavy boots carrying them slowly toward the setting sun. As the last of the retreating soldiers disappeared over the gray horizon, an incredible, unearthly peace descended upon the fields they left behind. The roar of the struggle, the agonizing crunch of leather on ice, the quiet, desperate whispers in the freezing dark, all of it dissolved into the vast and empty air. What remained was a landscape of profound, haunting stillness. It was a silence so absolute, so deep and unbroken, that it felt almost sacred. Without the thousands of men to disturb it, the Russian winter reclaimed its sovereign quiet. The wind, which had howled and shrieked with such fury when it fought against the marching lines, now seemed to soften. It dropped to a low, melodic hum, a gentle sigh that swept across the open plains, carrying with it a fine, glittering mist of fresh snow. Nature is a swift and quiet healer, entirely indifferent to the grand ambitions of men. She does not hold grudges, and she does not keep the scars of history open to the sky. Almost immediately, the thick, white clouds above opened their heavy arms, and the snow began to fall again. It did not fall as a blinding blizzard, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a closing curtain. Large, feathery flakes drifted down in the silvery light, tasked with the beautiful, silent chore of burying the past. Underneath this gentle, relentless snowfall, the violent geography of the recent months was slowly erased. The deep, jagged trenches that men had carved into the frozen earth with such desperate effort were gradually filled, their sharp edges softened into smooth, rolling dunes of white. The chaotic, churned-up paths, marked by the frantic struggle of horses and the deep ruts of heavy wheels, were smoothed over until the fields looked as though no one had ever walked upon them. The earth was being washed clean, blanketed in a heavy, undisturbed layer of pure pearl. The great iron machines, the trucks and the armored vehicles that had frozen solid days before, were left entirely to the mercy of the winter. Stripped of their roaring engines and their human masters, they lost all their terrifying power. The snow piled high on their heavy hoods and covered their cold, dark windows. They no longer looked like instruments of war, they simply became part of the landscape. They were transformed into strange, soft hills of white, looking for all the world like sleeping bears or ancient, snow-covered boulders resting quietly in the deep drifts. The frost laced itself over the steel grills, weaving intricate, crystalline webs across the headlights, sealing the iron in a beautiful, silent tomb. But it was not the sleeping machines that held the true, lingering ghosts of the stillness. It was the small, fragile things scattered across the snow, the intimate debris of 1,000 human lives, that spoke so softly in the quiet. Here, half buried near the roots of a towering pine, lay a heavy wool blanket. There, a battered tin cup, resting on a frozen log, slowly filling with fresh snow. And further down the abandoned path, a single, dark leather glove. To look at these objects in the immense, silent void was to witness the echoes of quiet, everyday heroism. That heavy blanket was not carelessly discarded. It had been left behind by a soldier who realized his legs were finally failing him. He knew he could not carry the weight of the wool and still have the strength to lean his shoulder under the arm of his wounded friend. And so, he chose his brother over his own comfort. He let the blanket slip from his aching shoulders, letting it fall into the deep powder, so that he might carry a human life just a few miles further down the road. The snow now fell upon that blanket, cradling it gently, a silent monument to a profound and selfless love. The tin cup had been dropped by a young boy whose hands were too numb to hold it. When it slipped from his fingers and clattered against the ice, the man marching beside him did not let him stop to pick it up. He had simply wrapped his own arm around the boy's waist, whispering that they would share from his cup from now on. The winter now claimed the lost tin, filling it to the brim with glittering frost, a quiet offering to the empty woods. And deep within one of the abandoned, shallow dugouts, a place that just yesterday had been filled with the huddled warmth of shivering men, lay a small, folded piece of paper. It had slipped from the inner pocket of a tunic in the frantic, dark hours of the early morning retreat. Now, it rested on the icy dirt floor, illuminated only by a single, pale shaft of winter sunlight piercing through the branches overhead. It was a letter, carefully written by the flickering light of a tiny match, filled with words of longing and gentle hope. If the silent forest could read, it would hear the voice of a father, reaching out across the frozen void to his young daughter. "My sweet girl," the delicate, graphite letters spelled out on the stiff page. "The woods here are so very dark, and the trees are taller than the church spire at home. But tonight, the snow is falling, and it reminds me of the winter garden behind our house. Do you remember how quiet the world gets when the snow covers the streets? That is how quiet it is here. I am sitting beneath the pines, and I am listening to the silence, and I am thinking only of you." The irony was beautiful and deeply heartbreaking. The father had written of the quiet snow to soothe his daughter's fears, using the silence as a metaphor for peace. And now, his letter rested forever in the very heart of that absolute, eternal peace. He had marched away, leaving his words behind to be guarded by the winter. The frost had already begun to creep along the edges of the paper, sealing the graphite onto the page, perfectly preserving his love in the deep freeze of the dugout. The letter would slowly be covered by the drifting powder, resting quietly in the earth, an undisturbed prayer sleeping in the Russian ice. For the men walking at the very rear of the retreating columns, the men known as the rear guard, casting a long look back at this landscape of stillness brought a strange, complex relief. They were the last to leave the frozen front. They walked backward as often as they walked forward, their weary eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. But as they looked back over the miles they had just surrendered, they saw only the magnificent, erasing power of the winter. They saw their own deep, agonizing footprints disappearing minute by minute, filled in by the gentle, sweeping hand of the falling snow. There is a deep psychological comfort in leaving no trace. For months, they had felt the heavy burden of carving their path into the earth. But now, the earth was taking it all back. The landscape was forgiving them. It was hiding their struggles, covering their failures, and wrapping the scarred, battered world in a pristine sheet of white. A rearguard soldier, his face entirely wrapped in a torn gray scarf, leaned heavily against his wooden rifle and stared out at the empty expanse. Just days ago, this very field had been a place of agonizing effort, of frantic digging and shivering prayers. Now, it looked like a beautiful, untouched painting of a winter paradise. The air was so clear, so incredibly still, that he felt he might shatter it if he took a deep breath. He felt no anger at the land that had defeated them. In the haunting quiet, he felt only a deep, humbling awe. The winter had proven to be a force far greater than any army, far older than any human ambition. It had closed its doors to them, denying them the White City, but in return, it was offering this vast, beautiful serenity to the fields they left behind. He slowly reached up with a mittened hand and pulled his heavy field cap down a little lower against the glare of the snow. He did not say a word to the man standing next to him. They simply shared a long, silent look at the absolute emptiness of the world. Then, in quiet unison, they turned away. They stepped into the footprints of the men ahead of them, surrendering the east to the snow, and walked slowly into the western haze. As the brief afternoon faded into the long, deep dusk, the landscape of stillness achieved its final, perfect form. The pale sun dipped below the edge of the world, taking the blinding glare of the snow with it, and leaving behind a soft, twilight world of deep blues and rich, velvet purples. The stars began to appear, piercing the heavy canopy of the sky one by one, shining with a hard, icy brilliance. They cast a faint, silvery glow over the empty steppe, making the endless rolling dunes of snow shimmer like an ocean of crushed glass. There were no campfires to break the dark. There were no hushed voices murmuring of home. There was only the great, silent eternity of the Russian winter, standing watch over the frozen fields. The White City, miles away in the dark, remained safe and sleeping, its distant spires entirely hidden from view. The earth had closed entirely over the memory of the march, tucking the forgotten blankets, the frozen machines, and the beautiful, lost letters safely beneath its heavy, white quilt. The wind sighed one last, long breath through the branches of the ancient pines, a gentle lullaby for the sleeping earth, before settling into a profound and perfect quiet. The scars were healed. The struggle was over. And in the vast, empty, beautiful dark, the snow simply went on falling, covering the world in a deep, unbroken, and everlasting peace. Some chills reach so deeply into the human heart that no earthly fire can ever truly melt them away. When the ragged, wandering lines of men finally stumbled out of the endless white void and saw the dark, solid shapes of the winter camps waiting in the distance, there was no great shout of triumph. There was no sudden rush of energy. There was only a collective, trembling sigh, a fragile exhalation of breath that was instantly swallowed by the biting wind. They had walked back from the very edge of the world, navigating a blinding, frozen ocean, and now, miraculously, the shore had appeared. To reach out with a frost-blackened hand and push open a heavy wooden door felt like stepping across the boundary between the living and the ghosts. Behind them lay the boundless, indifferent fury of the Russian winter, a landscape of screaming winds and towering, impassable drifts. But before them, as the door swung shut and the latch clicked heavily into place, lay a room bathed in the soft, golden glow of oil lamps. The sound of the wind was abruptly severed, muffled by thick timber walls and packed earth. In its place, the men heard the most beautiful, miraculous sound in the world, the gentle, rhythmic crackle of dry wood burning inside a heavy iron stove. They did not rush toward the heat. They moved with the slow, stiff hesitation of men who have forgotten how to trust their own senses. They simply stood just inside the doorway, the snow melting from their heavy, filthy coats and pooling on the wooden floorboards beneath their boots. They stared at the firelight dancing on the walls, their hollowed eyes wide and unblinking, trying to convince their exhausted minds that the walls were real, that the roof was holding back the sky, and that the long, terrible march was finally over. But coming back to the warmth is a strange and delicate transition. The cold they had endured was not merely a weather condition, it was an immense, physical weight that had pressed itself into their very bones. As they finally shed their heavy, icy greatcoats and slowly shuffled closer to the stoves, the true cost of their survival began to reveal itself. The sudden heat did not immediately bring comfort. Instead, it brought a quiet, agonizing awakening. As the deep freeze slowly retreated from their limbs, the blood began to push its way back into fingers, toes, and cheeks that had been entirely numb for weeks. It was a painful, burning thaw, a physical reminder of just how close they had come to fading away entirely into the white. Here, in the quiet, dim light of the barracks, the profound brotherhood that had kept them alive in the blizzard took on a softer, gentler form. The everyday heroism of the retreat transformed into acts of tender, intimate care. The men became quiet nurses for one another. A soldier, his own hands trembling with the painful ache of returning warmth, would kneel on the wooden floor before a younger companion. He would carefully, gently unlace the boy's frozen boots, peeling away the stiff, icy leather with infinite patience, terrified of tearing the fragile, damaged skin beneath. He would take a soft cloth, dipped in warm water from a tin basin, and slowly wash the months of dirt, frost, and suffering from the boy's pale feet. There were no words spoken during these small, sacred rituals. The silence of the room was broken only by the hiss of the fire and the occasional, sharp intake of breath as feeling returned to a ruined limb. They bandaged each other's frostbitten hands with clean, dry cotton. They shared 10 cups of hot, clear broth, one man holding the cup steady while another drank, ensuring that not a single, precious drop of warmth was spilled. They moved around each other with a quiet, reverent grace, treating their brothers as if they were made of the most delicate, fragile glass. Yet, as the physical ice slowly melted from their bodies, a deeper, invisible frost remained. The men who had returned to these winter camps were fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The boys who had marched out into the golden dust of summer, singing cheerful songs and dreaming of swift, glorious victories, had been left behind somewhere on the endless steppe. The men who sat on the wooden benches now, wrapped in thick, dry woolen blankets, carried the heavy, silent weight of the wilderness within them. It was a psychological scar, etched deep into their minds by the sheer, indifferent immensity of the cold. You could see it in their eyes. They would sit facing the roaring iron stove, the golden light washing over their sunken cheeks, but they were not looking at the flames. They were looking through them. They were staring back into the blinding white void, back into the howling blizzards, searching for the friends who had simply closed their eyes in the snow and never opened them again. The winter had taught them a terrifying, humbling truth about the fragility of human ambition. They had brought the greatest machines of the modern age, they had brought maps and plans and absolute confidence, and the land had simply buried it all beneath a quiet, heavy blanket of snow. This realization left them with a profound, lingering humility. The world was no longer a place to be conquered, it was a vast, mysterious entity to be survived. In the evenings, when the barracks grew quiet and the men lay upon simple wooden bunks filled with fresh, dry straw, the true weight of this transformation settled over them. The simple luxury of lying flat, of stretching legs that did not have to march, was overwhelming. They listened to the wind howling outside the thick timber walls, a sound that used to fill them with absolute, shivering terror. Now, separated from the gale by a solid roof, the sound was a haunting lullaby, a constant reminder of the frozen world they had narrowly escaped. By the light of a single lantern hanging from the central ceiling beam, a soldier reached into his fresh, dry tunic and pulled out his battered notebook. It was a miracle that the small book had survived the damp, the ice, and the frantic retreat. The pages were warped and water-stained, the edges carrying the faint, smudged dirt of the long journey. He found his tiny stub of a pencil, feeling the strange, beautiful luxury of holding it with fingers that could actually bend and feel the wood. He wanted to write to his mother. He wanted to tell her that he was safe, that he had a roof over his head, and that a fire was burning in the room. But as he rested the pencil against the paper, a deep, sorrowful hesitation stayed his hand. How could he possibly explain the distance he had traveled? Not the miles on the map, but the vast, terrifying distance within his own soul. How could he tell her that he was no longer the cheerful, innocent son who had waved goodbye at the train station? He felt older than the ancient pine trees they had sheltered beneath. He felt as though a piece of the winter had frozen solid inside his chest, a quiet, solemn space that would never truly know the summer again. He stared at the blank page, a single tear pooling in the corner of his eye, catching the golden light of the lantern. He did not want to frighten her. He did not want her to know about the ghosts in the white, or the agonizing silence of the frozen engines, or the way he still flinched when the wind blew too hard against the window pane. And so, he relied upon the quiet, protective heroism of a gentle lie. He would shield her from the scars of the frost. "My dearest mother," he wrote, his handwriting slow and deliberate, taking immense care to keep his letters neat and steady. "I am writing to you from a warm room. The marching is over for the winter. I am sitting on a soft bed, and I am wearing dry socks, and there is a fire burning so brightly in the corner that I have had to unbutton my collar." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath of the warm, smoky air, grounding himself in the reality of the room. "The journey was very long," he continued softly, picking his words with delicate precision, "and the snow was very deep. But we looked after one another. My friends are sleeping all around me now, peaceful and safe. I want you to know that the cold did not defeat us. We simply decided to come inside and wait for the spring. Please, do not worry for me anymore. I am resting, and my heart is full of thoughts of our home." He folded the letter slowly, smoothing the creases with his thumb. It was a beautiful, loving testament to his survival, masking the deep, invisible aches that would stay with him forever. He tucked the letter away, ready for the morning mail cart that would carry it safely back to a world that still made sense. As the lantern was gently turned down, throwing the long, peaceful shadows of sleeping men against the timber walls, the barracks fell into a deep, sacred silence. The men breathed in slow, synchronized rhythms, their chests rising and falling in the warm dark. They were wrapped in thick blankets, sheltered from the storm, and surrounded by the brothers who had carried them out of the ice. They would carry the scars of the frost for the rest of their lives. They would never look at a falling snowflake or feel the chill of an autumn breeze without remembering the blinding blizzards and the silent, sleeping machines. The winter had marked them, claiming a piece of their youth and leaving behind a quiet, eternal solemnity. But as they drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, cradled by the warmth of the stove and the safety of the wooden walls, they found a gentle, enduring peace. They had walked through the very center of the freezing dark, and they had kept each other alive. The cold had fundamentally changed them, yes, but it had not broken the tender, stubborn bonds of their humanity. They closed their eyes, letting the memory of the ice fade away, and surrendered entirely to the beautiful, quiet miracle of simply being warm. Long after the loudest marches have faded into memory, the earth simply exhales, covering our heaviest ambitions beneath a quiet, falling grace. If you were to stand today on the vast, open plains just a few miles west of the White City, in the deepest, stillest hours of a winter midnight, you would not hear the echoes of history. You would not hear the roar of engines, the sharp commands of generals, or the frantic, desperate scramble of armies trying to conquer the world. All of those loud, furious sounds, the sounds of men trying to force their will upon the earth, have been completely and eternally swallowed by the snow. What you would hear, instead, is the beautiful, haunting symphony of absolute peace. You would hear the wind, sweeping low and gentle across the endless, rolling dunes of white powder, sighing through the bare, silver branches of the birch trees. You would hear the soft, rhythmic creak of the ancient, towering pines swaying slowly under the weight of the frost. And if you listened very, very closely, you might hear the delicate, fragile sound of a single snowflake touching the icy crust of the earth. It is a landscape of profound, undisturbed stillness, a place where the winter has claimed its ultimate, undeniable victory. There is a deeply soothing, humbling comfort in looking out across these silent fields. They offer a quiet reflection on the incredibly fleeting nature of human ambition. In the warm, brightly lit rooms of distant capitals, men with maps and compasses had drawn bold, dark lines across the world. They had spoken of empires that would last for 1,000 years. They had believed that with enough iron, enough momentum, and enough young boys marching in step, they could bend the very horizon to their desires. But out here, beneath the vast, indifferent dome of the Russian sky, those grand, towering dreams were revealed to be as fragile as a breath in the freezing air. The empires of men are loud and proud, but they are entirely temporary. They rise like a sudden summer storm, full of thunder and lightning, and then they shatter against the ancient, unyielding realities of the earth. The winter does not care for maps. The snow does not recognize borders, or titles, or the colors of a flag. It simply falls. It falls with a slow, magnificent grace, indifferent to the struggles beneath it, patiently burying the pride of kings under a soft, impenetrable blanket of white. In the end, the great iron machines that were meant to change the course of history were left entirely paralyzed, reduced to nothing more than quiet, rusting hills beneath the drifts. The loud, sweeping declarations of victory were silenced by the overwhelming, heavy quiet of the falling snow. The earth did not need to fight back with fire, it simply withdrew its warmth, closed its doors, and waited for the exhausted invaders to finally turn away and walk home. And yet, within this vast, freezing graveyard of ambition, something incredibly beautiful and enduring was left behind. It was not the glory of an empire, but the quiet, everyday heroism of the human heart. When the grand plans failed, and the machines died, and the cold stripped away every single illusion of power, the men were left with nothing but each other. In the darkest, most terrifying moments of the blizzards, they did not find their salvation in their leaders or their weapons. They found it in the small, trembling hand of a brother reaching out in the dark. They found it in the shared warmth of a torn woolen blanket. They found it in the selfless, quiet sacrifice of a soldier breaking the trail through waist-high snow so that the boy behind him might have an easier path. These were the true, lasting victories of the long march. They were not victories over the land, or over an enemy, but quiet, beautiful victories over despair. Years later, when the men who survived this immense, freezing world sat in their own homes, safely tucked away in quiet towns and bustling cities, they rarely spoke of the history that the books would record. When the autumn leaves began to fall, and the first crisp chill entered the evening air, they would sit in their comfortable, upholstered armchairs by the hearth. They would watch the orange and red flames dancing in the fireplace, feeling the deep, radiant heat washing over their faces. And as they looked out their frosted windows at the snow falling gently in their own gardens, their minds would drift back to the silent fields before Moscow. They did not remember the anger. They did not remember the grand strategies. They remembered the profound, aching beauty of the camaraderie forged in the ice. An old man, his hands resting quietly on his lap, would close his eyes and feel the phantom weight of a draft horse leaning gently against his back in the dark. He would remember the taste of a single, frozen crumb of black bread, shared between 3 starving friends as if it were a royal feast. He would remember the letters. The thousands of fragile, folded pieces of paper that were written with numb fingers and tiny, wooden stubs of pencil. Those letters, sent back across the frozen continent, were the purest, truest records of the journey. They were not filled with talk of conquest. They were filled with an overwhelming, desperate longing for the simplest, most beautiful things in the world. A longing for the smell of cinnamon bread baking in a warm kitchen. A longing for the soft, ticking sound of a grandfather clock in a quiet hallway. A longing for the gentle touch of a wife's hand, or the bright, innocent laughter of a child running across a wooden floor. In the face of the vast, terrifying winter, the human spirit did not reach for glory, it reached for home. Many of those letters rest forever beneath the snow now, tucked safely into the pockets of boys who simply went to sleep in the drifts and never woke up. They are guarded by the ancient pines and the deep, eternal frost. But the words they contain have not lost their warmth. They remain as glowing, tiny embers of love scattered across the dark, silent plains. They are a testament to the fact that even when the body is overwhelmed by the cold, the heart can still burn with a fierce, beautiful light. The White City still stands, miles away across the horizon, its golden domes catching the pale, silvery light of the winter moon. It was never reached. It remained a dream, a mythical destination that floated just beyond the agonizing, frozen steps of the exhausted columns. But today, the distance between the fields and the city is no longer a source of heartbreak. It is simply a quiet fact of the landscape. The fields themselves have found their peace. The jagged, desperate scars of the trenches have been entirely smoothed away, filled with decades of drifting snow. The earth has forgiven the intrusion. It has washed itself clean, repainting the broken, battered world into a pristine, rolling canvas of pearl and silver. As the deep night settles over the steppe, the stars emerge, piercing the heavy canopy of the dark with a harsh, crystalline brilliance. They shine down upon the sleeping forests, upon the frozen, winding rivers, and upon the vast, empty plains. They watch over the ghosts in white, the spirits of the winter that continue to glide silently through the blizzards. They watch over the memories of the boys who marched into the golden dust of summer and were swallowed by the ice. It is time, now, to let the history rest. The great, terrible storm has passed. The winds have exhausted their fury, and the snow has completed its gentle, silent work. The loud, frantic struggle of men has faded completely into the beautiful, indifferent eternity of the Russian winter. So let us leave them here, in the quiet dark. Let us leave the sleeping machines beneath their heavy blankets of frost. Let us leave the letters safely tucked in the frozen earth. Let the wind sing its soft, mournful lullaby through the branches of the birch trees, a song of peace for all those who walk the long, impossible road. Close your eyes and listen to the profound, healing silence of the snow. Feel the warmth of your own breath, the steady, comforting beat of your own heart, and the safety of the roof above your head. The winter is vast, and the world is old, but the fire in the hearth will keep the cold away. The journey is over. The marching is done. And across the silent, endless fields, the earth is finally, perfectly at rest.